So first of all, welcome to everybody of this discussion on rural housing design, specifically in Northumberland, but also generally. Particularly warm welcome to all our speakers, our guest speakers, and thanks to them for giving up their time so generously to us. We've got a running order here, and my name's Graeme Anderson. I am the branch media officer, and I'll be the Zoom host today. And he's got me down the agenda by my military title, General Housekeeping. So we'll get onto that in a second. But we're recording from now on. Can I ask you, as a matter of courtesy, to mute if you're not speaking? There's a chat box, which Annie's mentioned earlier on. If you have any questions you might want to raise or any points, you can just put a question in the chat box or make your point in there, and we'll come around to you after every speaker. The format today is going to be, we'll have a series of speakers, which I'll introduce. They will give us a chat presentation, and then at the end of their presentation, there'll be space to ask a couple of questions, one or two questions, before we move on to the next speaker. If people feel that we might need a comfort break, we'll discuss that and raise that as well. So that's it from me. I was given till 1:03 and I've come in at 1:03, so I'm pleased with that. It's always a good sign. We're going to try and move things at a brisk pace. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Annie Lloyd, our branch coordinator, who so many of you know, and who has done so much to get this this event happening today. So Annie, I'm just going to pass over to you to introduce the campaign. And you should be able to screen share. You might have put yourself on mute.
Right, sorry about that. Share, and it's on the right one. Great. Okay, so can you now see a green screen?
We can. If you just click the enlargement side of things, it should. Fine.
Okay, has everybody got that?
Got it. Great,
super. I suddenly realised we've got no reference to COP26, so I put the climate change stripe across the top, just as a nod in that direction. Welcome everybody, great to see you all here. And although I'm going to keep my bit really short, I just wanted to provide you with a bit of local context. First of all, you've all been sent a programme which looks like this, and which we hope you've got to hand so that you know what's what during the afternoon. This slide just introduces the three of us presenting today from CPRE Northumberland. You've just heard from Graeme there on the left. I'm Annie, the branch coordinator, with Steve, my tech support here, and you can see on that slide Colin as well on the right there, our chair, who will be winding up proceedings at 3:30ish. So most of you will now be aware that CPRE Northumberland has been running a campaign this autumn around the current quality of new housing in our county. It was back in 2019 that we surveyed our members' concerns, finding it was the poor quality of housing development in our region that was their biggest worry. And there it is, top left, that green bar outweighing every other issue. So when we made a bid for additional funding from National Office last year, we knew that this was the issue that we wanted to campaign around. And here on the right is a very early mind map of what we were setting out to do. Our stated aim was to engage public debate locally with the aim of facilitating more design literacy and awareness of the ingredients of good housing. So we skilled ourselves up by ploughing through a lot of the emerging material at the time on design quality, and of course many of you will be very familiar with the couple of selected examples that I've shown here. I'll make these slides available afterwards, by the way, if I'm whizzing through them rather quickly. CPRE itself helped fund and create the housing design audit on the left here. And on the right, I wanted to mention that some developers started reflecting themselves on how standards could be improved. This, for example, is Barrett's Great Places document, which is well worth a look. But for the purposes of our little campaign, we've used this document here, Building for a Healthy Life. It's the latest version of a series of excellent documents identifying the criteria of good housing. This will be very familiar to many of you on this call, and if it's not familiar to you, then I really would recommend that you take a look at this document. It's available online. So our campaign stands truly on the shoulders of giants, reflecting their beautifully clear approach of this publication, and we've used their 12 headings. So we've borrowed one theme each week for 12 weeks, and we're currently in week 7. And we've borrowed the way that you can see here that they illustrate the good and the bad and the rest. So here was week 1. You can see the 12 themes there at the top, and underneath you can see our main post for that week, introducing the theme, the key theme. And those 2 yellow arrows show how our themes have simply followed those 12 themes in the parent document. And we generally follow it up over that same week with 1 or 2 supplementary posts showing it done well there at the top and done badly. So heroes and just occasionally villains. We're trying to use local heroes as well, but not local villains, because obviously we don't want to upset anybody. So this was then week 2, but don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with all 7 weeks of our campaign. If you're interested, you can find them all on our social media feeds. They're on Twitter and Facebook, and we post more occasionally onto Instagram. And do also see our website, Google us, in fact join us, never mind just Googling, CPRE Northumberland, you'll find us, and there on the website you will read much more about our campaign rationale. And my last slide, drawing this little introduction to a close, you can see here examples from weeks 3, 4, 5 and 6. Admittedly, it's been very difficult building interest and profile, and particularly response. This is our first shot at anything like this, but all that's for another day. We're confident that today's event will multiply interest and generate debate. So without further ado, I'm going to thank you very much for listening and pass you back to Graeme, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. I'm glad the screen sharing works. First off, always a relief.
I can't get out of it though. How do you get out?
There
we go. Is that? Yeah. Right.
Cracking. We're all back in the room again. Thanks for that, Annie. Very informative, and it gives you an idea of the context of the background from which this is all about. And you found it very interesting, Annie, haven't you? The feedback that you've received from people from various different organisations, and some of them are here today as well, showing real interest.
We've received a lot of assistance from a lot of very clever folk.
Well, I'm going to introduce one of those clever folk right now, and that's a change to the original running order. Rob Murfin, the Director of Planning at Northumberland County Council, was due to speak second, but he's got a meeting to go to that he needs to attend to this afternoon. So we've bumped Rob up the order, and we've now swapped him with Crispin. So I'm going to introduce Rob, reading from my notes here. Get these titles right. He is the Director of Planning at Northumberland County Council. He's also on the National Policy Board TCPA and the Planning Advisory Service and ADEPT ADEPT. You can talk about all those things, obviously, but the main subject of his presentation will be how should we put the right weight on the right issues. So, Rob, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Right, am I on?
You're on, Rob.
Thank you very much, Ben. I was going to get my presentation up and started.
So yeah, so you just free to screen share, Rob, when you want.
Right, can everyone see that?
Yeah, that's looking good, Rob.
Thanks. Okay. Really, my presentation perhaps should have come last today, because building on what Annie's just been saying about the various bits of, well, there's quite a few bits of design thinking out there at the moment. I suppose my argument is that we actually do understand the issue, because when we're talking about better design places, we are talking about better quality of design, and lots of the government guidance and the various think pieces are coming out summarise and I think nail that issue on the head. What I want to talk about though is actually how we get decisions made, because I suggest, like climate change, which has been mentioned quickly already today, health inequality and issues like biodiversity, we understand the issues, but the challenge is how do we actually lever those issues into proper informed decisions. Okay, I have to give you my normal caveat that I am speaking on behalf of the Royal Town Planning Institute and the Town and Country Planning Association, not necessarily my employer, because I have to give that caveat. Okay.
Yep.
So how do you actually make decisions about anything, really? We feel like somehow the wrong decisions are being made about quality of design. And so my presentation is looking at that and how do we influence actual better decisions. Okay, there's a great thing called a reverse dolly zoom. And if you've seen Jaws, you'll remember it from where Chief Brody's on the beach and he realizes there's a big horrible shark out there and it zooms into him and the background falls away and it's a real disconcerting feel. Okay, and I think I've had a couple of those moments, and there's a quick snippet there, a picture there of some very poor modern housing. And it's because I think fundamentally, even if we understand the issue that we're talking about in terms of design quality and the importance of it, there will always be a strong pushback from either commercial or ideological perspectives about improving design, even if we're showing that it's a rational thing to do, and there's evidence that by making poor choices now, we are just downstreaming costs to society later. And I think I had two of these key dolly zoom moments. I mean, the first one was in 1989 when I used to work for Greenpeace as a research officer, and I went to a talk on town planning, and I thought, actually, that's the way of changing the world for the better. And the second one, on a less happy note, was when I was chief planner at Sheffield. I was in seeing my executive director at the time, talking about housing design, and she came from, let's say, the background of being an accountant, so saw certain things in a certain way. But she was trying to say to me, in her own way, how planners will get obsessed with all the minor details and trivialities and got in the way of commercial development. And she leant back in her chair and obviously came up with the worst example she could have thought of at the time. And she said to me, planners are always doing things like wanting things built out of stone, or even worse, they're wanting in green cycle paths. And I thought for a moment, where does one start to begin? You know, to say actually, you know, these are key issues rather than just being sort of fluff that you add onto a decision. Okay. And it was a Tuesday in 2018, and I heard the Jaws theme in the background as she was speaking to me. I thought, okay, building on what Annie said, though, there is nothing new in this, okay? And a bit of a pub quiz ammunition for you. Famous Roman architect who said, actually, good, you know, so what is good design? You know, because various emperors and people have been saying that's bad design, that's not. And he said, there are three core components of what is good architecture and design. There's durability, in other words, it should be designed to last. I think the Romans can probably fly the flag on that one pretty well. There's utility, and it should be usefully and functionally meaningful for the people in the community using it, and it should be beautiful and delightful. It should, in essence, architecture should see places should try and delight. Okay. Jump into a more modern, even though it feels hard now saying more modern, we talk about 1898. Ebenezer Howard nailed it as well with his Garden City work, and Garden City is a peaceful path for reform. And I put his idea of the 3 magnets, because I've actually got a 3 magnets fridge magnet, which is quite ironic. Right, and actually, coming back to my point that we know all this, okay, and if you look at the themes that emerged from the Garden City movement, you know, start of the planning system, you can look there. You know, this was the late 19th century. They're talking about community engagement, land value capture for the benefit of the community, mixed tenure affordable housing, well-designed homes and gardens. I mean, if I can just stop, this sounds like something that's come out of the National Design Code in 2020, not something in 1898, okay? So you see there, generous green space, biodiversity, tree-lined streets, local services, walkable neighbourhoods, integrated and accessible transport. The only real word I've modernised there is the word biodiversity, and I think he just called it nature. Okay, well that's just an issue of the moment in terms of our language. Okay, so my point is, notwithstanding that Annie makes really good points, we know the direction of travel we need to go in, and it's how we need to make decisions on that basis and how we lever decisions. Okay. So where's it gone wrong? Okay, I would say in society as a whole, but particularly in the development industry and government, there's a recourse to what I call reductive or checklist-based thinking. And on that basis, you see some really abject failures like the permitted development right changes, okay, where you take single variables and then almost give them same weight. I would say false dichotomies and jobs, and post-COVID, another shark moment will be the Prime Minister's build, 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 which sort of sits ill at ease with their new conversion to the world of good design. I've called it a false dichotomy because too often in my career since the 1980s, I've seen, well, it's either jobs or X, or it's getting something built or going for good quality. You can't have both, you know. Okay. Also, I'd say we need to understand as well why certain places do well and certain places don't. And there are all manner of layers of disadvantage crop into this. And the one criticism I have of the UK planning system is that particularly since 1947, it has often been able to deliver good quality design in excellent places. It's not been so great as making less than excellent places into excellent places. In other words, it's protected what we've got pretty well, but not lifted up places. Okay. The entire issue from the first point about using reductive thinking and the changes to permitted development rights has also, I'd say, weakened the role of planning and design in placemaking. So, for example, when I talk to a big house builder, I spend less time talking about their standard house types, and I spend more time trying to talk to them about layouts that are right for the location. I won't name the major house builder in this region, well, in this local authority. I met very early on in because I've been here 2.5 years now. And I met them and said, okay, you've got a rural housing scheme in. Talk me through, and I had their design team in front of me. I said, talk me through how you've approached this design differently to one of your suburban housing schemes. And it was like I was talking Latin to them, you know, going back to the Roman quote. They generally did not know where I was coming from, or they chose not to blink to show they did. Okay. I would say that government sometimes listens to simplistic answers without questions, and the planning white paper is a case in point in that. The mass house building industry has been saying, well, we can't deliver you 300,000 or 200,000 homes a year if you don't let us do X, Y, and Z. I would say as well, in terms of public discourse and debate, we use too many straw men. In other words, painting, say, planning as just a tap that should either be tightened or loosened in different places for housing, or it's just a slow audit process for housing. In other words, as planners, we just sit on schemes and say yes or no, it's okay or not. It fails to understand the added value nature of how much we try and change designs. And again, without being overtly political, the planning white paper is hard to get away from when you look at some of the ideology underpinning this. And the pressure group, the Policy Exchange, who are a right-wing think tank, have now been openly hosting events for MHCLG. I think purely based on land value promotion rather than actually the delivery of schemes. And how that sits with, the entire planning for beauty agenda, I've never heard explained properly. Okay. All of this takes me back to that shark moment in Sheffield I had, and that we tend to underweight issues that are really important in design, and they're regarded as almost added value, discretionary luxury in places that it's viable to deliver it. Okay. So there's somebody who isn't on mute. I can hear really clearly. I don't know who it is. I think someone talking. Sorry. Okay.
Sorry, Rob. Everybody's Graeme. Can I just confirm? Are all attendees muted? I think. Can we just mute all attendees? Graeme, can you confirm? It seems to be Sue Sayer. That's it. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. The other issue about getting the right decisions made is let's not collectively fall into the trap to being painted into the opposing force to dealing with the housing crisis. And I almost put the housing crisis, I've spelt it wrong there, into inverted commas, because there are very simple messages. You hear about hard-working families deserve homes. And that quote there of newt counters was mentioned by the Prime Minister at the same time that his government was also introducing the biodiversity net gain legislation, which is the most onerous biodiversity legislation in a generation. Okay, but we need to be honest about certain things as well when we're looking at this, is that there are public concerns that in rural and coastal and in urban areas, the market for housing has been divorced from local communities and their incomes. And in many parts of the county, markets are being distorted upwards by second and holiday homes and retirees. And the default affordable delivery model that government normally relies on, in terms of you allow 10% or 15% of affordable housing in a scheme, doesn't work well in a rural setting. So, okay, permitted development rights in terms of design. That's probably the most famous example. That's the building on the right was converted into 4 flats under permitted development rights. I know everyone hates them, but from government have been hoodwinked, I think, to say it's a way of solving the housing problem. It won't be the most affluent living in places like that, will it? But look at that. I mean, is that something we want to be proud to pass on to next generation, into future generations in terms of design? Okay. Right. My big hint for you and how to lever in the arguments about design. Okay. As Jenny started off with, you've got the ammunition in terms of the analysis and the guidelines. And that is about getting design properly weighted and weight placed on it in the decision-making process and planning. This is, obviously I'm coming at it from a planning perspective. And that's the argument over when there's be unreasonableness, which is a really core issue, okay? And what that basically says is that any public body making a decision, providing it follows due process, is allowed to make decisions on merit, providing it's not been unreasonable, okay? And by unreasonableness, there was a very famous case, which I won't go into, it's worth Googling, and it's to do with showing lively rock and roll and musical films in a cinema in the 20th century, where a local authority was deemed to be unreasonable, okay? So what I'm going to say though is, I think given we understand this issue, that public decisions will be unreasonable if they don't weight properly good quality design, because government has said planning for beauty and all those agendas now. So what would be an unreasonable decision? Okay, so it would be, in making the decision, taking into account factors that really ought not to have been taken into account. And by that, I would say the false dichotomy arguments, saying, well, you either have it built and it's a home for somebody, or you go for a cheap, nasty design. Failure to take into account factors that ought to have been taken into account. And I'm not just dealing with Northumberland, but dealing with any local planning authority, is properly taking into account good design issues. Needs to be clear and upfront in decisions for housing, okay? And the final one is, you can argue that if we were to dismiss, as a corporate we, in terms of the planning decision of government, including the planning inspectorate, to be so outrageous in its defiance of logic that no sensible person would come to the conclusion. I think that's a good way of arguing that decisions have to be reasonable, and because design, with all the evidence, again, as Andy pointed out at the front, is accepted by all parties, that decisions should follow logic. Okay, more advice. Steps to proper weighting. We can add on supplementary documents or evidence to the local plan if they are adopted formally by either parishes, neighbourhood plan groups, or the county council. So design guides will form part of that, okay? These strategies carry as much weight as the National Planning Policy Framework. They've got to be based on evidence, not what you want, just what you can evidence is needed. I would say always push to look outside the site boundary, because developers always like looking inward and using off-the-shelf designs. I would say we need to challenge the planning inspectorate into more non-reductive thinking. Okay, the planning inspectorate love really simple decisions. For example, noise impact. Is a factory going to produce noise more than X decibels? If it is, and it's not in accordance with standards, then it gets, the appeal gets dismissed. I put the Rotherham flats in there. When I worked in Derbyshire, that's when we brought up with central government, where a block of flats in Rotherham was allowed permission on appeal, even though it didn't meet the Rotherham design guide, and it was lower than all the Rotherham space standards. The response from the planning inspectorate was, and get this, Rotherham is an area of low quality. The residents are used to low quality, so they won't be unduly offended by a low quality scheme. I'm not going to comment on that one, but we brought that up with central government when we read that one as a group of local authorities. Okay, training and the message. Don't just preach to the converted. All the messages we're talking about, I think, need to pass the cynic test. In other words, you need to be able to sell this to developers, saying, even if you're cynical about this agenda, here are the advantages to you. Be really clear that planning decisions are about balancing harm versus benefit. But I would appeal to you, do not assume in your arguments that change in itself is harm. and change certainly doesn't scale to harm. You know, good change can be good. You know, the entire landscape of this country is a palimpsest of, you know, different historical influences. Okay. What is a material consideration is also important in planning terms. I won't go into that, but I'm happy to do a separate session on how to argue material planning considerations. But it's about what weight, again, I keep coming back to this, what weight you attach to good design. And I would say agreeing on robust placemaking for good quality is a lot like agreeing with it's about a lot like agreeing about sustainable development. You have to define what you mean in that location. Okay, and that's why, coming back to the top of this slide, local design guides and codes are the way forward. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to have to nip off shortly, but I'll rejoin after my next meeting. So if we have questions at the end, I'll be able to answer them.
Excellent, thank you, Rob.
I have some time for some questions.
Do you need to go right now, or have you got a couple of minutes to ask?
I'm okay. I'm okay now.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for educating us on Vitruvius and Ebenezer Howard. I wasn't expecting that this morning, so it's worth joining for that alone. We've got a couple of questions for you. This one from Peter Bromley that's in the chat. And this resonates with something I was going to ask, because there was a time a while back where every new build had seemed to need to have solar panels on its roof, and then that was quietly dropped. But it seemed to be doing quite a bit of good. But Peter says, doesn't climate change and the desire to be net zero fundamentally change how we design? As in, should we even be building houses away from public transport hubs, for example? And does what is reasonable not have to shift dramatically to meet our targets? Is this a really big, sharp moment? So is there a dolly zoom coming with the climate question?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the point about locating houses and development on routes which are, routes which are capable of being used for public transport is the important concept, because that also then runs into the issue of designing for an aging population, because independent travel won't be the same, you know, as it is now in the future. Yeah, in terms of climate change proofing design, yes, there needs to be lots of changes, and lots of those will be driven bottom up through changes to the building regulations, and many of those can be incorporated on a relatively invisible basis. For example, you know, moves to outlawing the sale of gas-fired central heating systems and more use of air-sourced heat pumps. But it's a good point, though, about will it change the design fundamentally? I think we'll perhaps need to use a different palette of choices in design. And things like, well, the issue you've mentioned, to take one, PV panels. Already I'm trying to push developers who are building big sheds in terms of industrial commercial units, that actually the sustainability issue isn't about how well they're insulated or where they are, it's the orientation of the building. You know, orientating buildings to maximize PV, okay, may take you down some routes in terms of layouts. No, but I agree, it's something we need to have an honest debate about what we mean by an appropriate level of interventions. I would say, though, again, not every site is the same, and sometimes you are best to focus on passive technologies, and sometimes you can focus on active ones depending on the site and the local microclimate issue. I hear some fantastic good stories about this, though. You know, in fact, I hear some bizarre complaints, like from people who've got some passive houses we have got in the county, who have moaned that even when it hits -12 outside, it's too hot inside, even with the heating turned off, because the fridge and the television chucks out enough heat to keep the building warm. So there'll need to be some thought about what we actually mean by this. We are hoping to adopt our new local plan at about Christmas, and that includes an entire raft of new policies on this issue. So we'll be producing a supplementary planning guide to how to plan design for climate change. So that's a very long answer.
So does that represent an opportunity for you, Rob, and the planning department to go, right, okay, we can enforce these standards? Yeah. Well, on that subject, and I've got lots of questions I could ask you, but I'm just going to run through the ones that are on the screen here. Because
Graeme, we're only doing 2 questions per speaker, and we
all
must
right.
get off. So
I'll just ask this one. In that case,
question?
you can always come and ask later on, Rob, if you return. But just a question which chimes with what you were saying there. Can a neighbourhood plan influence development design? I think a lot of people are thinking that on this call.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. What I've said to government is, because they brought out like a national design code as a bridge to doing proper design. The view is that there'll be local design work done in terms of local vernacular or whatever. On a place the size of Northumberland, my view, and not to make it too onerous, is that we will use the National Design Code as part 1, and that at the parish level, ideally the neighbourhood plan level, often the same in this county, that group will produce a document saying what is different about the general assumptions for good design in the National Design Code that needs to be applied in this parish. And so that could be very light touch in some areas, but could be very prescriptive in others. And we'll be working to roll out with the neighbourhood planning groups how to do that. But the neighbourhood plan process is important because if you do that and you tie a design code onto your neighbourhood plan, and we make them the neighbourhood plan, that then gains full development plan status, and it becomes as important as the National Planning Policy Framework or our local plan. So yes, I'd really encourage people to do that, and we'll be doing some thought pieces on this after Christmas.
It's great, Rob.
We will be harvesting we've got 2 more questions in there from Debbie McConnell and from John Matthews, but what we'll do is we'll harvest those and make sure that we pitch those at the end to our panel. Thank you for them.
What to lose? Is it okay if I leave now and come back then after 3?
Rob, I'll keep an eye out for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. Just a bit of housekeeping here. David Thompson, that's your screen we're watching. So you're currently screen sharing. So if you could close your screen sharing window, if you can do, David. The person who's down is David Thomas Mason. Yeah, if you could just close that window, it will allow us to screen share. That's it. Perfect. Thank you, David. That's excellent. Thank you. Okay. Right. Well, thanks for keeping me right there, Annie. I'd have raced off for 10 minutes extra with Rob if I hadn't been brought to bear. I'll just introduce our next speaker now. It's our privilege to have with us Crispin Truman OBE and the CEO of CPRE, the Countryside Charity. This is basically our boss, all the way from London. And Crispin, you're going to talk on beautiful housing and beautiful countryside go hand in hand. So if I could pass you over now, Crispin.
Thank you very much, Graeme. Are you going to screen share for me? Is someone, or Annie, are you doing that?
I'll just make sure.
I can do it if you'd rather.
You're okay to do it now.
We were assuming you would share your own screen, Crispin, but I'll do it.
Okay. I thought you had it, so I'll find it. Don't worry. We'll get
Sorry,
it. No problem. Oops, wrong one.
I didn't get a chance to ask Rob whether Vitruvius was the same person who designed Vitruvian Man. I'm assuming he is. I'll ask him when he comes back.
There's a lot of blank looks here.
Vitruvian Man is that Leonardo da Vinci symbol. Remember the naked guy in the circle about proportions of limbs and stuff like that. Sure, it must be.
We've just had an imitation from John Matthews. That was something, quite something.
It's great stuff.
Very good, very good.
Yeah,
Am I sharing now?
You're starting the screen share, yes, Crispin.
Right. So that should now be the full slide.
It is perfect, thank you.
Right. Well, first thing to say is I can't believe you won't believe how pleased I am that Rob Murfin went first. That wasn't the original plan, but that was the right decision because he has done all the heavy lifting as the planning expert on describing good design and good developments and really done all the hard work. So I can just waffle on about CPRE and what it's got to do with countryside, which is a huge relief to me because I'm not a planner, I'm not an expert in this area at all. Although of course I do have the services of a fantastic land use and planning team at National CPRE who gave me some advice about doing this talk, and they are always available for advice and support on these issues. And actually it's interesting to hear about those poor old passive house residents who are too hot. Well, I can tell you, I'm sitting in a Victorian terrace here, which despite double glazed sash windows and solar panels is too cold for home working already. So apologies if you hear my electric heater going on here. It's absolutely freezing. It's only November the 1st, of course. So first of all, I just want to start by congratulating Annie and Graeme and all the team at CPRE Northumberland for this fantastic campaign on good housing design. It is so beautifully organised and set out, and the description Annie gave of it earlier was brilliant. So well done, and thank you very much for this work. And it's a brilliant example of what CPRE is doing now since we repositioned and rebranded 4 or 5 years ago as the Countryside Charity and started talking positively about solutions and about the countryside, rather than being forced, as Rob said, too often forced into a negative position of saying no to things. And that was just doing us no good at all. And as campaigners for the countryside, too often it's too easy for our detractors to say, oh, well, you're just against things and shove us in the corner. So we are very much trying to talk positively about solutions and how to get this right. And that's why it is so important to talk about housing, getting housing right for CPRE, because of course we are a countryside charity, we're not a housing charity. And when I joined 4.5 years ago, I was quite surprised by how much time we spent talking about housing for a countryside charity. And I wish some of the housing charities would spend much time talking about countryside, to be quite honest. But anyway, it is entirely right, because we do have to come up with the solutions, and we just simply can't have beautiful countryside if we don't have well-designed, beautiful housing in the right places. Which has always been a CPRE mantra: the right housing, right developments in the right places, not no developments and not no housing. So our vision is very much for a thriving, beautiful countryside that's going to enrich all our lives. That's where we want to get to. And absolutely integral to that is the right housing in the right places. And we have a very long historical association of involvement in this very debate. In fact, the very early days of CPRE involved housing design slides, very detailed ones. Back in the 1930s, housing design guides produced by CPRE were very authoritative and used by local authorities all over the country. So a very long history of involvement in this, and it's just as relevant now as it always was. So on the next slide, you can just see very briefly our broader strategy at CPRE. Oh, sorry, I'm doing the slides, aren't I? Here we go. So we have a strategy to move us towards that vision that I've just mentioned. And that is a 6-year strategy to 2026, which is our 100th birthday. So you can start saving up for our present now. And that strategy has 4 main strands to it. The first one is connect people and countryside, which is a whole range of issues around how we re-engage, particularly urban dwellers, with enjoying and visiting and understanding and learning about the countryside, but also therefore caring for it. And key to that, of course, is well-maintained, enhanced, accessible countryside near where people live. And key to that, of course, is good placemaking, good design, of which the built environment is as important as the natural environment. And of course, I should have said at the beginning, the history of CPRE is as much about the built environment as it is the natural environment. We were very much a heritage campaign organisation in the 50s and 60s when heritage was under huge risk. We tend to focus more on the natural environment side, but it's totally integrated nowadays. And in fact, one of my Bibles is the European Landscape Convention, to which Britain is still a signatory, I hasten to add, which describes the landscape in the broadest terms in a very holistic way, the cultural and built and natural landscape. We must always think about it in that integrated way. So our second strategic aim to 2026 is what we call remote rural life. And that's really about creating vision and a way forward for strong, sustainable rural communities in the 21st century. And absolutely key to that, of course, is the right housing, the right affordable, sustainable, needs-led, community-led, well-designed housing in the right places for rural communities. So we have a very strong strand of work, and that I'll talk a bit more about. And thirdly, we talk about empower communities as our third strategic aim. So a lot of this work that Annie and Graeme are doing is about responding to the concerns and visions and passions of our local groups. CPRE has local CPREs all over the country, like Northumberland, in every county. And one of the biggest issues for them, of course, is housing and design and location and tenure and affordability. Another big issue for them, of course, is democratic say and the role of local authorities in getting it right in the planning system. And we've heard Rob talk about how it should be. Far too often, of course, our local groups tell us it's not how it is. And lack of capacity and expertise in local authority planning departments seems to be a very big issue in there. So what are we doing about that? So just a quick summary of some of that work we're doing. Last year, we did a major piece of work on housing design, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and helped make design a major issue in the housing debate alongside others. Just a few other things we did last year. We improved the public support for wellbeing with the whole COVID lockdown. Of course, we saw the opportunity there to highlight the importance of green space and access to countryside for people, particularly in urban areas, and how, if we are with that wider awareness of that, how important it is now to care for that and to retain and enhance it. We made the case for a plan-led system, of course, with the approach to the planning reforms, which Rob also talked about. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We launched a regeneration manifesto for the countryside, which includes sustainable rural communities in it. Please do have a look on our website. All of this is on there, cpre.org.uk. And we also, importantly, in this moment of COP26, we positioned countryside at the heart of the response to the climate emergency. So our message is very much the greatest threat to the countryside is the climate emergency, even more so than poor housing development, although it's pretty close run thing sometimes. But also the countryside is key to the solutions. So countryside-led solutions, like nature-led solutions, need to be at the centre of that debate on what to do about the climate emergency. So, and as I said, this is a bit like Back to the Future. Here's some rather small, sorry, can't see them very well, examples of our wonderful design guides from back in the 20th century. Just examples. And of course, a lot of this stuff was pre-planning legislation, pre the 1947 Act. Oops. So we do, CPRE, we often look at all these things in the wider context of countryside and our wider vision. Although we've done that specialist work around housing design, we're often considering housing design also in the context of our other work. And that is, of course, most importantly at the moment is the government's review of the planning system and our response to that. And many of you will be aware, CPRE members, of the major campaign we launched last autumn in response to the planning white paper. We seem to have had a very good first phase of that. We saw off the housing algorithm fairly early on. We had a lot of very good media coverage and connections to governments every level. And we've now got a new Secretary of State for the department, Michael Gove, who is rethinking the whole thing. So we're feeling cautiously optimistic. We're waiting for the government's response to the consultation on that, into which, of course, CPRE fed extensively. So design very much a part of that campaign and will be in the next phase of it once we've heard the government's response. It's also part of our wider use on land use, wider work on land use and efficient use of land and land full cost recovery, land use planning and land value capture. It's central to our very considerable work around rural affordable housing, where we're arguing very strongly for housing in rural areas, but housing that is needs-led, well designed and sustainable and small scale, usually community-led, and meeting the needs particularly of key workers. We've done a lot of work on that, much of it in partnership. Linked to that, we are taking this more holistic view now of what makes rural communities sustainable in the 21st century. And part of that, of course, is placemaking, as Rob emphasised strongly, the importance of great placemaking. And that, again, is about integrating the built and the natural environments. So just a little bit more on our campaign around the planning reforms. We have a joint vision for planning. We've led a coalition. So much of CPRE's work is in coalition. We're a relatively small organisation for the size of the challenge that we face. And we've managed to convene a coalition and chair a coalition of 40 NGOs on the planning reforms. We've come up with an 11-point vision for planning, for a planning system with people and nature at its heart. Of course, I know you all understand that the planning system should be there to balance all the many, many demands on our land, our scarce land in this island, and to balance all the needs of development and nature and environment and infrastructure, rather than just ploughing through, as it seems too often the case, the interests of the development lobby. So we're trying to rebalance that with people and nature at the heart of the planning system. Strong emphasis on democracy and local say, which again is something our local groups are particularly passionate about. Too often it feels as though they don't have a say, or the local authority is not really representing the community interest anymore. You can view that online, and out of that has come 6 key tests which we're going to be using to assess any response the government comes up with. And again, they're trying to be positive about what the role of the planning system should be, including in responding to the biodiversity and climate emergencies. So another key strand of CPRE's work is brownfield. I saw there's an interesting question on brownfield we've been here before on brownfield. You're absolutely right, John. The key thing, and CPRE's big ask, is we need a compulsory brownfield first policy. We don't have that yet. We do have a lot more positive vibes from the government on brownfield. It was even mentioned in Michael Gove's speech to the Tory Party conference, which is a very short speech, but it had brownfield in it. We're seeing a lot of that in the rethinking of the reforms and the levelling up agenda. So we're very optimistic about brownfield coming back on the agenda. CPRE always campaigns on this because, of course, that is so much a part of the solution to not building on greenfield, is to build on previously used space. And we reckon, no, we don't just reckon, research proves again and again, year after year, that there is enough brownfield in this country for over 1 million homes, and that it regenerates. So as you build, as time passes on, more brownfield becomes available. So there's a huge supply there of land that is not being used. But we don't just campaign on it. We also do a lot of practical action, working with our local CPREs to identify brownfield land, often poorly done by local authorities, but brownfield registers are not well kept up to date, and to keep the pressure on the departments around that. So that will be a big part of this year's campaigning, we expect, given the government's renewed interest in it. And just a few other areas that we're working on. So housing design is very much an issue for our local groups. As I've said, there has been a long-term history of disastrous housing design planning. Just a few other things there that have come up recently. The government's land use change statistics show we're now building less housing than in 2007, but using up nearly twice as much farmland and green space in order to get that housing. Just an example of how bad design is often about how we use the space and lack of density. The Royal Institution of British Architects HomeWise campaign recently found that the average new build house at that time in 2015 would have failed to meet the new space standard. The Rainsford review of planning that TCPA led, that we were part of, also criticised the quality of housing, particularly on the permitted development rights. And transport, such an important issue. Transport for new homes, so much of the core design is about location, and the massive overemphasis on car use and storage. Transport for new homes actually found that 40% of the land devoted to new housing developments wasn't for housing at all. It was the cars, it was tarmacs over for storage and moving of cars. That is a grotesque waste of land. And so there's great work by Transport for New Homes going on there, funded by the Campaign for Better Transport, one of our close allies. So our housing design audit last January was the last thing we did before lockdown. We actually had a live face-to-face launch at UCL. Again, very much done in partnership with UCL, University of London, and the Place Alliance. This is a big countrywide audit of housing design. 142 developments were reviewed by our professional partners. Overall, it did find a small overall improvement in particularly safety and security and variety of types, but that was pretty much it. The improvement was very relative. So overall, 3/4 of the housing developments looked at were, by the government's own standards, mediocre or poor. 1 in 5 should have been refused planning permission outright on the grounds of the government's own planning standards for design. And most disturbingly, perhaps, but I guess you won't be surprised, design quality gets worse the further you get from London and the more rural you get. So you can see the relevance to CPRE here, that rural housing suffers the most from this, and those the less well-off disadvantaged communities suffer the most. The other big link between housing and CPRE, of course, is one of the main reasons people object to housing. So often communities are forced into this negative position of saying no to housing is because it's rubbish, badly designed. And as our partner, Professor Matthew Carmona, who's the chair of the Place Alliance, said, good design, high quality design, actually transforms the residential, the community's response. High quality design makes new residential developments more acceptable to local communities, he said, and delivers huge benefits from a social, environmental and economic perspective. So as Rob earlier said, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a dichotomy between rubbish housing and no housing. Actually, you can have good quality housing and get the housing you want, and get the housing that local communities will support and back. And we see that all the time at CPRE. Good design and quality and right tenure, the right size, the right location, the right affordability, gets community support. So one of the areas we looked at, of course, was the North East. So I won't dwell on this for a shorter time, but overall developments in the North East were dominated by mediocre scores, with over half of schemes scoring a mediocre classification, which is very depressing, below the national average, I'm afraid. And while the region had seen a 12% increase in the portion of good and very good schemes in the last decade, there also been a disappointing 4% increase in the numbers of schemes falling into the poor and very poor categories. I mean, why are they even built? And very, very marginal improvements in average design scores. So the North East has fared badly in this respect. I'm sure you're very aware of that. Particularly, design factors particularly poor were around loss of green space and biodiversity to create over-engineered developments. So that was especially concerning given a low average standard for this criterion nationwide. So mediocre is pretty bad. Schemes in the North East also performed worst for diversity in housing types and tenures. They came bottom on street legibility and definition, which is really important, and refers to how easy it is to get around the streets and what makes them safe and walkable and sociable. And finally, unfortunately, the scores for provision of and access to community facilities, again critical, and access to green space and public spaces and public transport were significantly skewed to the lower ranges. That means bad. So I'm very glad that CPRE North East is Northumberland launching such an important campaign this time. Clearly the need is absolutely evident from our research. But on the positive side, what are we looking for? So we're welcoming the government's renewed focus on design and the BBBBC that Nicholas, who's joining us, I think, from Create Streets, has been so instrumental in, the Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and the Office to Place and National Design Guides that are coming out of that, very positive, and the new £2 billion Brownfield Fund, of course, all good stuff, but not enough, and we continue to ask for that Brownfield First policy. We want to see a number of further reforms, including more emphasis on quality planning outcomes rather than just speed. We want reform of the new homes bonus. We want fast tracking of the future home standard. And we want clearer expectations of the house building industry. No question of that. We want more priority to expertise and commitment to quality in local government. And our local groups tell us all the time that lack of capacity in local government has been so badly hit by cuts over many years. Planning has really suffered, as we all know. So design as part of that. We want more affordability, and we want improved public transport network. So we're very pleased that following the report of the BBBC, the government consulted on, then published a revised national planning policy framework in July of this year, and the early signs are encouraging. But the government is still allowing too much poorly located greenfield developments coming through the system. So in this coming year, 2022, we will be campaigning on the full review of the NPPF and calling for a Brownfield First policy, as well as, of course, more focus on the climate emergency and tackling this shortage of affordable homes in rural areas. And there's some of the examples of what CPRE is campaigning on there is for community-led, needs-led, well-designed, vernacular, sustainable homes built on brownfield land where possible. But of course, in rural areas, that's not always possible, but if it is local and near to services and good public transport, with the support of the community, we're on side. We are working with communities and partners to create and promote a positive vision for living in the countryside, bringing together rural affordable housing with other solutions for rural economy and community and infrastructure and access to green space. That ties into our joint planning vision. It's all about working with partners. We have some great partners in the housing sector, Shelter being our big campaign partner around rural affordable housing, and then some great rural housing associations, Hasto and English Rural, as great examples, and I think these are some of their buildings here, doing the work on the ground. Another key theme for us is transport, and we did this review of transport deserts in rural areas last year, which found a pretty dire picture, so often linked to poor location of new housing developments. And this year we've come up with a positive programme on that, which is our Every Village, Every Hour campaign, calling for a massive increase in rural public transport, bus services in particular, with a big focus again on linking housing to good transport and not having more car dependent housing in the countryside. And in these weeks of the COP26, how more important could that possibly be? So in the year ahead, I hope I'm reasonably on time, and he's just looking forward a little bit here. We'll be keeping our focus on all of this, on the planning reforms, on brownfield, on housing design, and sustainable rural communities. This is just a list of our forthcoming campaigns in the year ahead. That focus on planning reforms. I've talked about our hedgerows campaign. I hope you've all seen that. All about the countryside solutions to the climate emergency. Encouraging young people to stay in rural areas, all affordable housing, of course, absolutely essential to that. And key workers. And during the COVID epidemic, of course, we saw the importance of key workers. And in fact, in rural areas, they often can't afford to live in the communities they serve. We're working on waiting for the full response to the Glover report on national parks. We're looking at renewables, how to do that well without sacrificing the countryside. Of course, we're at COP 11 of our younger staff, and actually a mix of people from CPRE of all ages have gone up to COP. We're all going up this week briefly. And we're looking at a range of other issues there. Finally, Greenbelt and Brownfield, as ever, our annual focus on getting the building in the right places and not sacrificing the countryside for it. So that's what CPRE is up to in this area, so that by 2026, we do have more an enhanced countryside, sustainable, low carbon, thriving rural communities, that we have a legislative and enforcement framework that actually enhances and protects land for nature, well-being and climate, and a reformed planning system that has communities and nature at its heart. And if we get there by 2026, we'll be having a big party for our centenary. Look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Crispin. That was excellent, a great and comprehensive review there, really, of what CPRE is all about and what we're all trying to do. I'd be interested to hear any questions that we might have. Not often CPRE members get a chance to actually talk to yourself, Crispin. So if anyone has any questions that they want to ask, fire away. There is one question I see here, and it's any comment to make about land banking by volume house builders? And this seems to be something which doesn't really get the kind of publicity it deserves, in the sense that everyone talks about a housing shortage, and no one really realises that one of the biggest reasons for it is that the developers are banking these applications.
Yeah, huge problem. We're very aware of it. And the Letwin review, the government did do a big review of this a couple of years ago now, wasn't it? The Letwin review, which called for various changes to address it, but it seems to have disappeared into the long grass. Some of my colleagues on this call might have more to say about that, but a massive problem.
And then there's a good question, here, which it's a bit like a full toss for you to knock out of the park, this one, I'm afraid, Crispin. What are your plans to protect hedgerows? Important old hedges in my village are threatened with destruction by the owner, and we feel powerless. And there's a perfect opportunity to talk about, I think, a campaign which was launched recently, which seems to have caught the imagination.
Yeah, it's a great example, and it's going to be one of our big campaigns next year. Hedgerows and planning are our two major, what we call hero campaigns for the year ahead. We had a big launch, a very successful launch of our hedgerow report. So one of the answers to the question is we've done some serious research on it, and we're making the case for hedgerows, not just in terms of their obvious benefit for the climate and biodiversity, but also, of course, thinking landscapes and more traditional CPRE territory and their benefits to farmers and the economy. They've been for too long seen as an impediment to agriculture, but actually we're finding that they're hosting for natural predators, and the benefits crops can actually save farmers money. So we're making the case. We've had one campaign already. We're going to have another one. We had a big parliamentary launch with the Secretary of State. And the great thing about the hedgerow campaign is it's really a very positive and warm and cuddly campaign on one side, but also it's hard political stuff on the other. So we've got a hard ask for a 40% increase in hedgerow cover by 2050. That's to try and make up for the huge loss since the Second World War, as Sharon has rightly highlighted. We're trying to get DEFRA to include that in their programme around environmental land management schemes for farmers, and to get a hard target in there. There's hard targets for peat restoration and trees, I believe, but still not for hedgerows. So we're really going for that at every level and having a big popular campaign as well. So it's central to our work. Thanks, Crispin. I can see Sue has got your hand. Susie's got her hand up. Sue,
might be an accident, but if you want to put something in the chat, ask a question from there, I guess. Because actually, incredibly, we're still on target time-wise. Keep the schedule. Annie will collate the questions that aren't asked here, and we can ask them at the end. So now I'm going to pass on to Nicholas Boyd-Smith. Nicholas, I think you've recently joined us. Are you there, Nicholas? Can you make yourself heard?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was on mute. I had to demute myself. Hello, I am here.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll introduce you because you're our next speaker, and we're bang on time, so I'm really pleased about that. And it's Nicholas Boyd-Smith, everybody, and you are the founding director of Create Streets, a social enterprise which argues for high density, low-rise homes and places. You previously co-chaired the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and you currently chair the government's new Office for Place. They'll be talking here in a personal capacity, and you're going to be talking about turning everywhere into somewhere. How can we plan for a happier and healthier future? So, Nicholas, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm sorry I've not been able to be with you. I'm just turning on my screen. Hopefully that is coming up. Has that come up?
It is, yes, it has, yes.
Brilliant. And I'm just trying to make it full screen. And I caught the last of what Crispin was saying there. Thank you, Crispin. Sorry not to get the beginning. I feel I've been bouncing off calls all day. And you want me to speak for 5 hours? Is that right, Graeme? No, that's not right. But it's about 10 minutes. Is that 10, 15 minutes? Is that right?
That's about right, yes. Yeah.
Fine, brilliant.
You have 20 minutes, 25 minutes if you wanted, Nicholas. We'll ask questions at the end.
Well, I promise I'll try not to take that, because no one ever complained that the talk was too short. So I was just in case any of you feel like you need a cup of tea, I'm going to tell you right now that the 4 things I was going to try and say that hopefully will be of interest. And obviously, if you decide they're not of interest, then you've got other options are available. I was just going to say a little bit, I guess, coming out of the work of Create Streets, the social enterprise I run. In a way, I guess, saying to all of you as members of the CPRE Northumberland that, you're right to care about the quality of places. Good design, the types of places people like to be, wish to be, is not actually subjective. There are discoverable relationships between the types of place we live in and our own mental and physical health. So I'll just talk a little bit, quite fleetingly, about some of that research. I'll say a few things about what some of the consequences of that might be for planning better, and some of that will chime. Some of it may contradict, I don't think, profoundly with what Crispin was just saying. I'll say a little bit about design codes. So some of you will know the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework that were consulted on in January and then formalised in July, again, which I think Crispin just referred to, but a far greater focus, I think rightly in my judgment, on having a more visual planning system. And I'll just say a few things about some of what we're learning about that. And then if I get the time, just sort of put in, because it's the first day of COP26, I thought I'd make a quick point about a sort of lifetime approach to sustainability as opposed to a sort of thin green or transitory approach to sustainability. So I hope that feels interesting. Graeme, does that sound like what you wanted me to talk about? Because if not, you should say so now.
No, that sounds ideal, Nicholas.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, look, your environment can affect your life, and that your health and your sort of physicality. It can affect how happy you are, how active you are, how many neighbours you know, how stressed you feel, how much you fear crime, how healthy your diet is. Lots of ways in which where we live affects who we are. A recent-ish American meta-study estimated that about 40% of our personal health was a function of where we live, and the rest is a function of our genetics and the choices we ourselves make. So it's not deterministic. You're not a robot. You're not controlled by your environment, but you are influenced by it. As some of you may recognise, the chart I've just brought up. This is from about 20 years ago, from Lord Rogers' Towards an Urban Renaissance document from 1999 from memory, which made the case for what became known as an urban renaissance. I hope this doesn't seem off subject for a CPRE talk, but actually on the need to get some of our city and town centres working as city and town centres again, and that actually getting a bit more density into those can be actually beneficial to place quality. And that's led to many improvements in the place quality, particularly I think it's probably fair to say in London and Manchester. I think they're probably the cities that have benefited most from the urban renaissance, with pedestrianisation, clean air policies, taking cars out of some key streets or public realms. This as you probably know, it's a way away. Forgive me. This is the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square in London that was pedestrianised about just under 20 years ago and has transformed the space. Actually, it's a much better, cleaner, healthier, happier place. However, and it's quite important, however, the vast majority of people in this country, as it's actually said in every country I've ever seen polling, other than I think Turkey, slightly curiously, a detached home does actually remain the preferred choice of the vast majority of us. And there's a lot of studies that show that that level of control we get from having a house as opposed to being in a flat, the immediate access to personal space that we can control, is associated with better well-being outcomes, more sense of control of your own environment. So there's a contradiction there, if you like, between some of the policy we've been following for the last 20 years, certainly what is, I say this is something we largely agree with, that was fashionable in design and development views, and actually what most people say they want, and you can see in some of the pricing. One of my favourite quotes, George Orwell, that the British people, the English people, even when they're not what they're most like, even when they're not communal, are not official, the pub, the back garden, the fireside, and a nice cup of tea. We all want control of our own environment. And that leads to tension, of course, because, you know, as you all know, very low density development has much higher requirements in terms of the amount of infrastructure that it requires. This is Central Siena and a motorway exchange in Houston at the same scale. One, as you can see, is the home to thousands of people. The other is home to no one, but it is providing infrastructure. How do we square this? If we're going to develop a low density model, it's not just that takes up more space, but the roads and the streets to get there take up more space. Now we make the case, we can create streets for what we call gentle density, which is a way of getting some of the advantages of propinquity, but also some of the advantages, oh, sorry, I just hit the slides by mistake, forgive me, but also some of the advantages of personal space. So terraces, could be semi-detached houses, mid-rise mansion blocks. So the advantages of your own personal garden, whatever, very easy access to a communal garden, but also the advantages of density, that you can perhaps walk to the shops, or you can associate the journey to the school, to the journey to a local hub. And we see this as some of the way through our design and development and housing challenges. Because if we just sort of step back and think about some of the research, actually long commutes are basically bad for us. Vast majority of studies show that, and it's not just that they're bad for those of us who do the long commutes, they're actually bad for our families as well. They're correlated, particularly when they're car-based, high blood pressure, frustration and divorce in families. And there's very good evidence from the States, slightly less good from Europe, showing that longer commutes are associated with lower levels of community involvement, partly because they reduce time to take part in it. So there's a sort of, there's a tension there between the advantages of being in control of your own environment and some of the consequences of it if we're having to make huge long commutes. That may not be the case anymore, of course, with the post-COVID world. Another clear finding, and I suspect you don't need me to tell you this, and to put it very simply, is that the greenery is basically good for us most of the time. There's a famous study done more than a generation ago now by an American social scientist, Roger Ulrich. It's a lovely piece of research. He took a series of patients in 2 hospital wards and had enough good data and data points to be able to make comparisons between patients with similar levels of illness and at similar age and similar socioeconomic status. One of those wards looked out onto greenery and the other looked out onto a wall. You can probably see where this is going, but the patients in the ward looking out the greenery, it wasn't just that they got better faster with statistical significance, they actually stayed better longer subsequent to their departure from hospital. And there are multiple studies subsequently that correlate exposure to greenery and vegetation in daily quotidian life, and actually above all, the activity of being in greenery and of gardening, almost of physically touching the soil in some studies, with better mental and physical health. And you won't be surprised to hear this probably also with high value. So people will pay for properties which have a good view on greenery. It comes to street trees in a moment. That's not quite always the case. You can have, if greenery is associated with fear of crime or with a fear of someone jumping out at you, you can have it associated with high levels of stress and higher antisocial behaviour. So it does matter how it's designed and how it's used. The clearest, or some of the clearest evidence is on street trees. There's no sort of no-brainer in urban design, but street trees are probably as close as you get to it. They're associated in every study I've seen, to the best of my knowledge, in every study done, with cleaner air, slower cars, people walking more, with better residents' health, with higher values. You can get into, and I think it's legitimate to get into lack of certainty about to what degree that's causation and correlation. To some degree, it doesn't matter in the sense that if people who can afford to choose streets with trees are consistently choosing them and paying more for them, which they clearly are, then clearly there's something that is popular. So there's a combination of things going on there. Hopefully this is of interest. I'll crack on. You should also obviously shout if not. Another area that is, I think, quite clearly associated with data with good outcomes is clear blocks with clear backs and fronts, where the green space is either safely public and overlooked, and you can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see here this square which is well overlooked by houses with associated doors and windows, or is clearly private with gardens in which children can play safely without their parents having to watch over them. This type of block structure is associated with low crime in Australian and UK studies, and when you've got nice sharp angles such as here, with traffic moving more slowly and indeed with reduced need for traffic. What buildings look like also matters. This is one I get into trouble with architects sometimes. This is a lovely study done a few years ago on the west coast of the States, where students posed as lost tourists in front of these two buildings in the same part of the same city. And you can probably see where this is going. You've probably read it below the pictures. Nearly 5 times as many passers-by randomly offered to help the spuriously lost tourists in front of the buildings on the left versus building on the right, with similar multiples offering to lend them their phone or lead them to the destination. And in fact, there's a not quite so good study done a few years previously by an Israeli academic, had similar findings in terms of people's reported satisfaction in different places. About 62% of people's response, well, exactly 62%, was a response of where they were, how stressed or happy they felt, and the rest was a function of who they were. So the types of places we like tend to be, as I say, clearer block patterns. Also colour is something we like. The most photographed streets in many cities are the most colourful ones, and actually areas with some colour tend to have a positive effect on our mood, in peer-reviewed studies. We also tend to like shapes, this was true of faces by the way, which are symmetrical or near symmetrical. Again, every single study I've found shows that. And actually our most popular buildings often have embedded symmetries. Either have symmetries or near symmetries at multiple levels. These are and our brain is, I mean, we know why this is increasingly. Our brains are literally pre-programmed to find those easy to interpret. So we can get our head around a symmetrical form more quickly than an asymmetrical form. Our brains, our bipolar brains are pre-programmed to understand and interpret that easily. Areas of mixed use, those which combine retail, residential and commercial uses, I think in pretty much every study are associated with people walking more, with cleaner air and with fewer and shorter car journeys. That mixed use has become a planning mantra over the last generation, and it's basically a good thing. How traffic works matters as well. Crispin was rightly touching on this. This was a study done a while ago, actually again another American study, though it's recently been replicated in Bristol actually, where 3 similar streets were studied. One had heavy levels of traffic, one had moderate, one had light. Again, you've probably read the numbers, but let me just flip to the graph. These coloured lines here map the friendship patterns on those 3 streets. And as you can see very clearly, the number of friendships, particularly across the street, in the heavily trafficked street in red, is dramatically lower than in the lightly trafficked street with blue. Now, again, to some degree, this was a self-fulfilling process. People tended to stay living on the lightly trafficked street for longer because it was a more pleasant place to live and had more time to build up that web of friendships. And I should say that local friendships, the types of conversation where you have perhaps quite a sort of superficial conversation with someone on a regular basis, it might just be a minute here, half a minute there, tend to be good for us as long as we're in control of when we have them and we don't feel that we're obliged to talk to people when we don't want to. Perhaps immediately if we come out of a front door into a double-loaded long corridor, that tends to be slightly intrusive of our sense of personal space, but as long as it's over a wall or when we choose to have that conversation, it tends to be well associated with good mental well-being. This is a tricky one actually. This is one that's perhaps a little bit more double-edged. Steps are good for our health. Basically, physical activity and quotidian activity is good for us. Most of us, I'm afraid to admit, don't go to the gym every day. I'm afraid I don't. I never go to the gym. So if we lead a life where we're not only able, but actually are obliged to do as much physical exercise as is reasonable for our state of health, that's basically good for us. Lots of studies that show, for example, in offices with less good lifts and more steps are associated with less fat and healthier workers. I'm not sure that's still true of the last 2 years. It presumably isn't, but it only was pre-COVID. There's a very good longitudinal study done in the States showing that older citizens living in flats with non-level access stayed physically healthier for longer. Now, of course, that's double-edged, because you obviously can't have level access if you well, you need level access if you aren't able to use steps. But there are these effects we can find in our built environment on us. Modest front gardens are another good one. This is actually in an area where we're currently doing a project in Grimsby. Modest front gardens of about this size here are shown in a series of Danish, Australian, and also I think one Dutch study to be associated with using outdoor space more and knowing more of our neighbours. When front gardens get too big, if you like, they insulate us from our neighbours. But when they're of this small size here, a modest size, they're actually associated with space that we can control, garden influence, and from which we can speak to neighbours, perhaps in a neighbouring garden or as they pass by. And again, knowing our neighbours tends to be good for us. What a place looks like, our level of satisfaction with it as a place to live in, is also associated with our overall place satisfaction. It's been found in a couple of well-controlled American studies, and perhaps in an even stronger study in the UK a few years ago. A study was done of the scenicness, to use the academic who did its phraseology, of over 200,000 images based on 1.5 million human responses to those. And the places that were photographed most and found by people to be most scenic, to use her phrase, were correlated with better mental health than people who tended to live there. So what places look like, how they feel, their level of embedded symmetries and colour matter. And then again, perhaps if you disbelieve that type of research, let's look at the numbers, let's look at the values. This was based on a study we did on every single property sale in London. We also looked at other cities, which had similar results, and not quite as strong because there were a few data points. And this was essentially looking at every single sales price and then disassociating the different drivers of those values. And I won't go through all the data, it'd take too long, but in a nutshell, the chart on the left is picking out what effect certain factors have on the value. If you like, the place premium, or you could call it the heritage premium, areas with an above average number of pre-1900 properties, an above average connected node ratio, which is a measure of traditional street pattern, or above average proximity to the nearest listed building, between 4 to 7 times higher than the premium associated with a new build versus an otherwise identical non-new build. So the place, and that's also adjusting for centrality. So the places we live in, make a big difference, not just to actually observe behaviours and mental and physical health outcomes, but also actually how much we will pay to live there. Perhaps at one level that's not surprising, but my point is that you can to some large degree predict those. So we've actually used this analysis and other similar to it to create something which we call a street score, and we can pretty healthily and easily predict outcomes and values based on what's called urban morphology. The data on the right, and this was actually the most consistent across the cities, so we barely moved at all, is predicting index of multiple deprivation. Again, we were able to predict areas of high index multiple deprivation, which is a aggregate variant of social and economic poverty, based on areas of quite high urban density, but with a high proportion of unbuilt land, as opposed to a more traditional street pattern. I'll just jump over the next slide. I don't want to go on too long. We use some of these tools actually. We dropped if you like a tranche, a slice into London, and then looked at what were the most popular and least popular areas visually. And these were the predictors of high quality places. These were some of the lowest scoring places in the tranche we sliced in London, and these were some of the highest scoring places. Again, you see a clear pattern, often have greenery, and above all you have a sense of enclosure, and you have a sense of variance in the pattern. It's a Dutch study that shows something similar. I'll jump over that. Second point. So that's my first point. So hopefully you're still with me. I think I've got a few more minutes. That was the longest point. The rest will be much quicker. One of the consequences is for how we plan and for how we steward existing and new places. Crispin, I think, mentioned briefly the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report, which I co-chaired. I think it'd be fair to say that when we kicked off our work, it was quite controversial. A lot of people said it wasn't something that was necessary. What became increasingly clear as we did our work and as we got large numbers of public responses, essentially saying, we're so pleased you're talking about this. The quality of the places that we need matters. RTPI, All Time Planners Institute, ran a survey. They found the members thought it was sensible. Civic Voice ran a survey. They found it did. The quote on the bottom right is just a couple of the quotes from many that we received from members of the public. Actually, there's a desire, I'm certain, to have a conversation about the quality of the places for lived experience that we create and how we manage existing places. And I just don't think that's been happening for much of the last generation. These are some of the surveys I referred to. And this was some work that, just as we were doing our work, the Place Alliance, largely led by UCL, did, again, finding that about half to 2/3 of places we're currently designing are mediocre or poor. And this matters not just for the place quality, but also for the number of homes that we create. Let me just, sorry, I've gone too far. The challenge for younger generations, as many of you know, it's less true in some parts of the country than others, it's true for much of the country, is that affordability has reached seismically low levels, and that has profound consequences for social equity, political ramifications. And lots of the reasons given for this are nonsense. So we don't have more empty homes than other countries, we have far fewer. We actually have, though building affordable housing is definitely part of the answer, we don't have fewer socially rented or affordably led priced homes. We actually have rather more than the European average, and it's not led by low credit rates. Ultimately, we have not enough homes per household, despite suppression of household formation over the last generation. This is national level data. It would be particularly true if you start pulling it out regionally, whereas we're very dependent for economic growth, overly dependent on the southeast and a few other hotspots. And we then don't have enough homes in those places and aren't able to generate enough economic activity in other areas. The thing that is different between our system and pretty much every other, with partial exception of Ireland and Portugal, is that we have a very different planning system. So it is perfectly normal, and has been since time immemorial, I think I've got a historical slide coming up, to regulate what is built. That is something that's literally happened for as long as there have been towns or cities. And it's not at all new in the UK. If you like, both right and left make the same mistake on this in the political debate in this country. They think that sort of planning started in 1947 with the Town and Country Planning Act. That is incorrect. And I can come to history in a moment. But what is odd about our system is actually our local plan is a far weaker document than the equivalent documents in most other countries, which, and you can see here, tend to be more binding and clearer, and set a clearer framework for what isn't acceptable. So if you like, the democracy is brought forward into the plan making process and is less focused on the development control process. Now the disadvantage, and you may be thinking this, the disadvantage, if you like, of every other system is that you rely more on the local plan. The advantage is that you've got clearer democratic link between what is acceptable and what is built. The other consequence is that most other countries have a far higher proportion of self-build and custom build, and a far higher proportion of small companies building homes, because they're able to understand what is regulatory acceptable. And you can literally, in many cases, order your house from a catalogue, because it is very clear what is and isn't acceptable locally. This is, I'm almost just pull that at random, most from a self-build catalogue in Sweden, though I could choose dozens of others. That's an almost impossible model in this country, because you need to go through the planning permission process, and therefore you don't know what will or won't be acceptable. And here you can see some of the data on the disproportionately low proportion of self-build and custom build in the UK. And I heard a comment about land banking as I came on the call, and with greatest respect, I'm afraid the question and the answer was nonsense. So sorry. The reason we have land banking in this country is because we're so heavily dependent on a small number of very large house builders who build up a bank of homes because they know how long it takes them to get property through the entire land allocation and planning system, which is certainly, depending on how you've done the numbers, and Oliver Letwin was quite right on this, is between 5 and 8 years for a large site. So of course you have land banks because you have to have a pipeline for the large builders to do these large sites. I mean, it's an unfortunate consequences of the mess we're in on that. So we need to get to a situation, I'd argue, where there's greater regulatory certainty, greater focus on quality, so that a larger number of smaller firms and self-build and custom build are able to respond to that need. And just to give you a historic example in our country, here's a pattern book from the 1820s, essentially responding to the third London Housing and Building Act, which set the types of house that were possible to build in London. And then builders and pattern books just responded to that. Just a couple more quick points, then I'll stop in a moment. I think this is Octavia Hill, and she made a case that we all need beauty for the refreshment of our souls, and put that into action in the social housing that she built in South London. This is one of the social housing developments she supported, and what we in the B4C report came out with, and do have a look at it. I think a lot of it is influencing some of the current government work. Was a series of responses to level the playing field for planning, to bring the democracy forward, put a huge focus on regreening our towns and cities, and some of that's come through into the MPPF with a requirement that all new streets should have street trees, to incentivise responsibility to the future, and that's going to require some key tax changes. The moment landowners are essentially incentivised to sell their land or option it quickly and not to stay involved for the long term, because that creates a very disadvantageous fiscal situation for them. And I pull out there's lots more I could go on here, but I'll pull out the one at the bottom, management. At the moment, though it's improving actually in the last 18 months, but it's still problematic. It is difficult for the public sector not to sell land to the highest bidder, and Homes England has been putting far too much focus on quantity and price and not enough focus on quality. That's beginning to change, but there's still a long way to go. There are also big issues with the education, I think, of some of our architects and planners. So these are some of the things that we talked about. I'm not going to go into more detail on that, though I could. I'm happy to come back to that. I'll just say one more thing, and then or two more things, and I'll stop. So we made a case of trying to move from a vicious circle of parasitic development with unclear quality asks from the planning system, leading to opposition on the ground to new development, even if there might be support in principle, to an insufficient supply of new homes in the right place, and to a non-level playing field from with planning putting a downward pressure on quality, to move over a generation. It will take a generation, it won't be a 5-minute operation, to a virtuous circle of regenerative development with clearer and more predictable quality asks from the planning system, removal of unintended incentives for the next field development model, so that more people, we won't get there in a bound, see development as likely to be a net improvement. And that's the key thing I probably should have said earlier. At present, most people have an instinctive expectation that development will make things worse. There's a YouGov poll a couple of years ago, 2% of people trust developers and 7% of people trust planners to create better new large places. That's even if you don't believe that number, if you'd like to double it or triple it or quadruple it, it is still way too low. So to try and move over a generation away from that instinctive opposition to new homes, more sense of agency in designing and placing new homes, and to remove some of the degree of speculation from land prices, so it's easier for SMEs and self-builders and custom builders. And so that's what we argue for. I'm just going to take two more things. Some of that, not all of it, has been put into the new National Model Design Code, which I do recommend reading. It's a good document. And the advice we in Create Streets give to those of you, and I suspect some of you are involved in creating design codes, is set out the vision incredibly clearly at the beginning. Use simple, concise, and clear language throughout. Split it, we always say, into three buckets: things that developers or development must do, non-negotiable, should do, and could do. I think that's probably self-evident. Do use the underpinning evidence and research on what makes for popular, healthy, and sustainable places. This is the Create Streets version of it on 2 pages. We've also got a video. Other options are available. This is probably, in a way, this is probably the most important, actually. Keep your design codes short and visual and numerical. The problem, as one very senior planning QC put it to me not that long ago, is that if you have, and I'm afraid I've seen this in pretty much the majority, certainly more than half of the neighbourhood plans I've read in the last few years, if you have vague statements about appropriate design, high quality design, good design, bluntly, that can be used to mean anything and is. I was just looking at something yesterday, put forward in an area of outstanding national beauty. It's going to go through. It's an outline consent. It's very poor, but the neighbourhood plan is so poor and so loose that the local council, I think, hasn't got a leg to stand on in turning it down, and it is on a brownfield site. That's the key one. So keep design codes short, visual, and numerical. Do create them with a wider community. That's probably something that you, as a set of people, don't need to hear. Engage wide and engage deep. And the good news is, it's getting easier and easier and cheaper to engage with a wider number of people. There's always, I think, been a slight, I don't know, it's criticism. I suspect it's true of the CPRE. It's certainly true of some of the workshops we've run over the years. There's a slight tendency for the people who turn up on that proverbial wet Tuesday afternoon or evening to be more able, more highly skilled and experienced. But thanks to the marvels of digital engagement, you can now get out to a wider number of people more cheaply. This is the visual mapping tool that we run. Again, others are run. We got to nearly 1,000 people in a few days on a question about what streets could or should be improved in the area around Leeds, and had other successes subsequently. Also, and I think overlooked, is do try and work on local codes. And this is, I suspect it's particularly true for you and for less metropolitan parts of the country, with local builders and craftspeople. One of the things that just comes through so frequently is people feel part of function of our overalance and smaller developers. People feel that development's done at them and to them rather than with them. People do value the local and the vernacular and the local material. It's also more sustainable. You see different responses to red brick, say in polling we've done in Yorkshire versus Sussex, where of course you do. So, you know, understand what quarries are still there, what's available, what can be done. I think that's very, very important, particularly in rural areas. We're doing some work in Cumbria at the moment, and you can see that very, very clearly. And then finally, last point, sustainability is not just about energy and use. I don't for a moment say that is unimportant. It is important, but the lifetime of our buildings matters enormously, and creating places and buildings that are worthy of being recycled or reused matters immensely. The energy embodied in a Victorian semi-detached or terraced house would drive a car about 8 times around the world. The most energy efficient building in the world would probably normally take about 80 years to catch up the lost embodied carbon if you rip down a Victorian house to put it up. So the lifetime of homes and their adaptability matters, and creating lovely places means they get readapted. This barn in front of us, I don't think will ever be reused as a barn. It might, through permitted development, turn into housing, but it won't be reused in that form. This barn here, which by coincidence I was visiting the other day, is nearly 1,000 years old and is now an art gallery. It's had multiple uses in the intervening years. Of course it has, because it is a lovely building that is worthy of preservation. So those of you, and I suspect it's all of you, who care about the countryside and the quality of our places, in doing so, you're not just being indulgent or aesthetic, so nothing wrong with being aesthetic, you're actually being, in the deepest sense of the word, sustainable, and that really matters. So there you go, there's my 4 pointers. I hope I didn't go on for too long, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much, Graeme.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that astoundingly data-packed presentation. I mean, my head's throbbing with all the information. I think I've been on shorter courses and learned more. That's incredible detail.
I hope that's good. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. The head is throbbing. What do you reckon?
I mean, it's good. It's given us lots to think about. While we're processing that, shortly I'll ask Annie to maybe ask you a couple of questions that have arisen from it. But it would be remiss of me when we were switching over. I didn't fully thank Crispin for his presentation because of all the technological jigger report we were doing. But one thing which really leapt out from Crispin's presentation, probably resonated with a few of the people on this call, was that stat which said that design quality gets worse the further you get from London. Well, in this country, you can get much further from London than Northumberland. So maybe the people want to comment or talk about that. But in the meantime, Annie, if you're there, other questions are in the chat for Nicholas?
Yeah, there's been a really interesting discussion in the chat box rather than discrete questions. I mean, perhaps I'll just read a little bit of this because you won't be aware of it, Nicholas, and then you can just jump in. Andrew Wood, who's our senior spatial planning, Crispin, help me out here. I can't remember Andrew's job title, but he's national CPRE and a planner. It says that this may not be specific to Northumberland, but it can be the case that people living in villages actually have less access to green space and nature than people in urban areas where they've got parks and green corridors. Are there examples out there of predominantly urban lessons of public space design, density, walkable neighbourhoods, etc., being implemented in rural settings? I don't know if you want to say anything to that. Sorry,
I was on mute. Sorry. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, so forgive me, Andrew. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, the lessons, I think, in an urban context are that most people don't walk very far to use green space, I'm afraid to say. This is humanity as it is, not perhaps as it should be. Most of us, I'm sure not all of you on the call, won't walk more than about 2 to 3 urban blocks to make use of an urban green space. That's probably not how it should be, but it is how it is. And the green space that has the most impact on our daily lives is that is closest to us. So a garden, or a green way to get to work or to take the kids to school, whatever it might be, that will have a big impact on your mental well-being. Lots of greenery over there that you never see or use will have no impact on you other than possibly improving the air that you breathe, which is not trivial. So I guess if you live in a flat in a village and don't want to go for a long chunk in the countryside, because there are public rights of way, I assume, then you're not going to make use of the countryside. Then you're not going to benefit from that. So should villages have village greens? do you need, and this is something some of the villages near me, if the main street or streets through a village are busy and dangerous places, you ain't going to walk along them. So how you get streets which are also roads running through a village to feel like safe spaces, I think then becomes, I suspect, I'm speculating on Andrew's question, the key question, and how you do it also without just sort of overwhelming the road with lots of the sort of high-vis junk that can actually spoil a rural village. And the answer to that basically, that is not, is you narrow it. So you you pull in the carriageway, you make the street, the footpath wider, you possibly put a tree into part of the carriageway. You signal to drivers as they come into the street or streets, this is an area for residents and pedestrians first, and for you second. You may not be able to block or ban the cars going through, and you probably wouldn't want to, because they still need to get from A to B, and the village is sort of in the middle of A to B. So you can't do that. That's not one of your options. But you signal to them, not just by having a great big thing saying drive slowly, but by the fact that the carriageway gets smaller and narrower, and there's possibly a tree in the middle, not in the middle, but it's on the side of it, that they're just going to drive slowly. And the good news is, the great news is, we are actually rational in how we respond to how a street and the road is designed. When they get narrower, and when we're not sure if a kid's going to jump out in front of us, we do drive more slowly. It's absolutely unambiguously clear from the data. So you don't need to overdo it and turn it into a high-vis fest. You can actually just do it through clever design. But I'm afraid, and this is probably slightly hackneyed, Poundbury is a marvellous example. Until quite recently, there was a mortality there quite recently. Until then, there had literally not been a mortal car accident there in its first 20 years, because the streets essentially are ones that are designed for pedestrians first and for car users second. Though there is a bit too much parking in the early phases. I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Nicholas. I mean, John Matthews comes in. John is chair of the Northumberland and Newcastle Society, saying, yes, it just shows the importance of a comprehensive heritage strategy in urban areas, the reuse of historical assets rather than demolition, and it's also greener. And yes, and then Penny Blythe flagged up to Andrew that yes, she has lived experience of the points that he was making. So I think then the conversation went on to land banking. So I think that would be more suitable to save until the end, when hopefully we get our Director of Planning back, Rob Murfin. So is that okay? And also we are now running 4 minutes behind time. So I think we need to thank Nicholas again. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I learnt more from it. Graeme mentioned a short course. I think I learnt more from that than I did in my degree. Both of them. So thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. I really look forward to watching the recording back, and actually really absorbing some of those points. So thank you. And now we're going to, yes, I'll pass back to Graeme, because you're going to do the intros for Nigel.
Yes, thanks. And I echo what you were saying there about the amount of material to consider. And it's great that this is being recorded. So I'll have to watch that back again, Nicholas, and absorb it properly. Shortly we'll hear from Sarah Winslow and Sarah Dyer. But before that, and I'm being very patient for hanging on, I appreciate that. Before that, we're going to go to Nigel Jenkins, who's our next speaker. And Nigel is an architect, and he's the chair of the County Committee of the Northumberland and Newcastle Society. And he'll be talking to us on the subject, Notes from a Housing Designer, the What and the Where. So, Nigel, if you're there, if you could make yourself known and heard. You're probably on mute, and I'll just talk.
You're on mute, Nigel.
There you are. And that's the fastest screen share yet, by a country mile. So you're on.
You can hear me now, yeah?
Yes, and you're already into a winning start, Nigel. Well done.
Okay, right. Well, at one point, the running order had me last, and I sort of added that into my introduction to say, if I was last, I feel a bit like the last dancer on Strictly. You know, everything's been happening before. You've seen it all happening before you arrive. Also, I'd like to say that I'm not making any excuse for making this a very personal chat, and not on behalf really of the society. I'd like to introduce myself for those who don't know me. I am a retired architect, although I'm apparently still allowed to call myself one. for 30 odd years, hang on, what happens here? How do I move this on?
Nigel, have you got two screens?
No, I've only got this one screen. How do I move my thingy? Because it started.
Well, as a backstop, I've got it here. I can share your PowerPoint, but just take your time. Is there an arrow? Graham's there.
Oh yeah, got it. Fine, sorry, there's an arrow.
Well done.
You can tell I'm not familiar to this sort of thing. Okay. Nearly 40 years ago, I set up a practice with my wife called Jenkins Partnership. I had previously worked in housing. My mentor, Jacqueline, designed Park Hill Flats in Sheffield, so Rob would be interested in that. We worked over the years on a variety of sizes of scheme, from large housing schemes. This one was part of a 3-phase scheme in Jarrow, to a self-build 2-storey conservatory on the end of somebody's barn conversion, a friend of mine. So that's the sort of range of stuff we did. We worked from Bamborough in the north to Southport in the Midlands, absolutely called Midlands, Southport, and for various clients, but mainly housing associations, local authorities, private developers and private individuals. Our experience in the rural Northumberland involved schemes in places such as Longhoughton and Embleton, and in latter years a lot of smaller projects around the area where I lived at the time, which is near Harbottle. In the meantime, I had been a member of the Northumberland and Newcastle Society for a long time, probably early 70s actually, when we moved back to Newcastle. But 10 years ago, I got more heavily involved. I joined the county committee, at which time we had 12 members and the chairman was Robin Dyer. I became chair of the county committee 5 years ago. We're a smaller outfit now, so we're limited as to what we can do. The county committee's interests or concerns range from wind farms to open cast mining on a larger scale. On a smaller scale, the conversion of buildings in our market towns. This one is the baths in Hexham, which is being converted into flats. And this is actually a vision of it as it's being converted. You can see the flats in the background. To housing schemes relating to the smaller villages. This one is actually in Long Framlington, which has had quite a lot of development recently and more on the way. So coming to the where. Well, I mean, Northumberland, we in the county committee for some time we were thinking of having a housing award for good housing in rural areas in Northumberland. It never got underway, but one of the things we talked about was what is rural, because in Northumberland we have the southeast area, Blythe, Cramlington, etc., quite rural, the market towns, villages and smaller settlements. The question really is, in our area, how is the location of a new scheme decided? I think Rob's really covered that in his talk, but clearly in the last 10 or so years, because of national policy coming to the fore and the local plan taking such a long time to come to fruition, I have to say the first mention of the local plan on the county committee was 10 years ago. Then there's been a little bit of a window of opportunity, in my view, and so things have been built in places where, in my opinion, they shouldn't have been. I remember 20 years ago, in Northumberland, you weren't allowed to build anywhere except Morpeth, the county towns, Ashington. Certainly none of the smaller villages were you allowed to build probably even one house. So it's been a sea change. I take this example in front of me here as an interesting one which I came across riding my bicycle out from Morpeth a few weeks ago. It's in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't actually tell you the name of the place. It's got a reference number here, but it's halfway between Morpeth and Ponteland. And this is what it looked like a few months ago from the air. I assume
Twisel, Nigel.
Twisel, thank you very much.
Twisel near Stannington.
Yeah, from the air it looks like some sort of a farming industry, pig farm or something like that. And from the street it looked like this, and it literally is surrounded by fields. So the last time I rode my bike past it, this was being built, and I thought, my goodness, this is very suburban. It's a cousin scheme called Greystoke. In their brochure, it says it's lovely because it's so close to amenities. You can get there to the airport quickly in a car. It's typical of schemes that are being built around the place. The house styles are generic, and you wouldn't be able to know whose they are, actually, to be honest. The fascinating thing is that this plan shows how many have been sold. And I think probably of the ones that have been made available, well over half have now been sold. And they range from about £400,000 to £600,000 each. Presumably these people are going to drive to wherever they go. There's no bus service, there's no connectivity, there's no local facilities. It really breaks all the rules of what we've been looking at today. And I can only assume it got through planning because it's on a brownfield site, ironically. So it just was one of those things that came to mind when I cycled past it. What happens then is that people have decided to build a house, to build some houses somewhere. How do we decide what to build on the site? Early days of my chairmanship, chair of the county committee, we met in one of our members' houses in Long Horsley, and he was on the parish council, and this is a site in Long Horsley which a pre-planning design was produced, I think on behalf of the parish council. And you can see from the layout that it's fairly low density. It's rather nicely addressed as you come off the street into a sort of green space, a whole variety of building forms with open spaces, courtyards, and so forth. And this, along with some visuals which showed the sort of things you'd see in a design guide, was the basis, presumably, for looking at any developer who came along. What happened then was, this is what actually came in as a planning application. I believe one of the reasons why the entrance has been moved to the right is traffic safety, so that one has to forgive people for that. But as you can see, what's happened is that none of the houses address the main road at all. There's not even a space that addresses the main road. So from the public's point of view, this place hardly exists. The density has gone up greatly, I think. And the house types tended to be mainly detached. Interestingly enough, and we'll come back to this later, the elevation you can see on the right is what's coming through a bit more now in the area. I call it kind of stripped down vernacular with very simple windows, but basically the house shape is typical of what used to happen. In Thropton, we have a site which is right on the edge of the village. This was the outline application information showing fairly lowish density, but houses created around courtyards, and for my mind, you know, a pleasant layout, fairly relaxed layout. 60 houses. The current planning applications for 80 houses, and interestingly enough, for those councillors on Zoom today, this is Ascent Homes who are doing this, which is, I think, your housing arm, with a style of houses which has become typical of that particular developer. They're cropping up around the place, which are quite architectural, grey windows. So this is the way in which good intentions tend to get diluted, I think, as things go through the process. Annie and I got involved in this. Well, she asked me to get involved on behalf of the society with the campaign, and so to relate the two societies together. And we did a trip around Northumberland a few weeks ago, looking at various housing schemes. One of which was this one in Stannington, which, to my mind, answers quite a lot of the questions. I quite like the idea of housing facing onto the street, so that we have a housing facing onto the street here on the right hand side, and a loose layout so that you get more interesting. I'm going to have to move on shortly. More interesting streetscapes where there's some open space, some greenery, the road curves around, even though the layout of the houses is rectilinear. For me, a very, very nice place to live. Okay, it's upmarket. The second scheme I've shown here is actually one of mine. It's just embarrassing to show. In Rothbury, very tight site. The scheme addresses the streets with an archway through into two courtyards. It's a mixed development of houses and flats. It pulls pretty heavily from the vernacular locally. I'm not saying we should all do that, but at the time, this is what seemed to be appropriate. But the internal spaces, I think, are well thought of. Another scheme, really rural scheme, where the parking is being put to the rear of the houses, which means the houses can address the street, which I really do favour. Coming on to what style of houses we should build. It's an interesting one, isn't it? These three slides are for various places. This slide is seaside. Okay, so we've got Almouth, Beadle, and Newbigin, and all very different from each other. Town centres in the market towns, we've got Morpeth, Corbridge, and Alnwick there. Again, very different styles. Rural, Chollerford and Embleton. So it all starts. The whole idea of design guides for me could actually be rather restrictive. I'm in favour of moving on. We need to build things that you can recognise are of their time. Annie lent me a book last week called Contemporary Vernacular Design, and all of these are illustrations from that book. Now, I know people think that we should be trying to reflect their locality. I can tell you that these are all from very different bits of the country, and I couldn't tell you by looking at them which vernacular they're supposed to be reflecting. And I'm not absolutely certain how important it is, but I'm flying a kite here and playing devil's advocate, especially having read and seen what everybody else is aiming for. Just to finish, which is another slightly tongue-in-cheek thing to do. Recently, I moved with my partner into Morpeth, and I've lived right in the middle of the countryside, and we're a new partnership. And during the first lockdown, oh, hang on, there's a little one here, a little funny one, right? Chimneys. People are putting chimneys. I've done it on new housing, which don't do anything. These ones actually ventilate the house, the ones on the left. So there's a lesson. On the right, storing bins. Well, I designed that little thing in the front there, which is big enough for a wheelie bin. But we have 3 each now, so I don't know what these people are doing nowadays, to be frank. Anyway, we moved into Morpeth and we went around the town having our daily walks, looking at estates to decide where to live. And it makes you realise that over the years around Morpeth, the style of housing that's been built is huge, hugely varied. Not a lot of it actually relates to the local vernacular. Is there a lesson? Anyway, you'd be surprised to see that what we decided to do, well, me partly, was to move from a converted Basel house, which took about 20 years to convert on my part, to this one on the right, which I really love, and I'm enjoying living in it, but it's not vernacular. When I showed it to my sisters, she thought it looked like Stepford Wives. It's very American, and I don't have any idea who designed it, but it was built by cousins in the 60s. So the estate is fantastic and the house is great, so I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nigel, for that tour around Northumberland. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Very interesting points you make. I'm conscious of the time. We're running a little bit behind schedule now.
Well, we will.
And I do, Sarah's awaiting. So any questions in the chat, Annie?
We've only got one from Nigel's partner, Penny. About, I mean, I would just say Southport in the Midlands, Nigel, really? That's a very Northumberland specific location. I think most people would place Southport in the northwest, only Northumbrians perhaps in the southwest. But yes, Penny asks, how do policies, codes and guidelines in rural contexts ensure affordability?
The answer to that is, as far as I can see, affordability can only be provided now by housing association and local authority providing rented houses, and that's what we need to look for.
Thank you, Nigel.
Short and sweet. Thanks, Nigel.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we now turn to the last 2 dancers in Strictly, according to Nigel, who are Sarah Winslow. Yes, you're on.
Partner.
You got your sequins ready? So I shall introduce you without further ado. Thanks for being so patient, Sarah. This is Sarah Winlow, historic. And Nigel, can you mute your system? Thank you. Sarah Winlow, Historic and Built Environment Officer, and Sarah Dyer, Heritage Consultant for Northumberland Coast Area of National Beauty Partnership. And you are both here to talk, again, super fast screen sharing, really impressive. You are both here to talk about the Northumberland Coast Area of National Beauty Design Guide, Recipes for Success. So I'll let you, you're on now, Sarah, thank you.
Thanks, Graeme, thanks for that introduction. So I work for the Northumberland Coast AONB Partnership in the role of the Built and Historic Environment Officer. And part of this role is advising on planning applications, which do include new housing, for their impact on the Northumberland Coast area of outstanding natural beauty. And we were delighted to be asked to join CPRE's Northumberland's campaign for great new housing design. And part of it was because we're at the working face of change in the built environment. We hope that we'll be able to share case studies from the Northumberland coast as the campaign moves forward. But this afternoon, we're just going to outline what we're doing to encourage great design in the AONB. And the title of this joint talk is Northumberland Coast AONB Design Guide, Recipes for Success. We already have a design guide, and my colleague and co-presenter Sarah Dyer will be talking about her work to refresh this important document in the second part of this talk. But riffing on Annie's ingredients, I'm going to take you into the kitchen where we're working and have a look around. So for those not familiar with the Northumberland Coast AONB, it covers 138 square kilometres of coast from just south of Berwick-upon-Tweed to the Coquet Estuary at Amble. It was designated in 1958 and is one of 34 areas of outstanding natural beauty in England. And along with national parks, AONBs represent the nation's finest landscapes. And the designation of AONBs and national parks was established by the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, and the primary purpose of the designation is to conserve and enhance natural beauty. So more impetus to do this, to conserve and enhance, was given in 2000 under the Countryside and Rights of Way Act that requires all public bodies, so the local authority and parish councils, as well as statutory undertakers, to have regard for the purpose of conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of AONBs. And this is the reason why the AONB partnership provides planning advice to the local authority, as because the advice we assist helps Northumberland County Council in carrying out its statutory duty to have regard for the AONB. So just to recap, the principal purpose of the designation is conserve and enhance that landscape for its natural beauty. So what, you may ask, does this have to do with buildings and settlements, placemaking and great design? And Crispin touched on this earlier in the afternoon about the crossover between, there is no crossover between countryside and built environment, they're all part of this one landscape. So unpacking that term natural beauty, it's in the designation's name and it crops up in the NPPF as landscape and scenic beauty. And like the images that have preceded this one, when we think of natural beauty of the Northumberland coast, imagine you're thinking rocky headlands, sweeping sandy beaches, rolling dunes, castles in the distance, and mud flats. But there's more to it than this. There's more that makes it distinctive, because amid this often dramatic landscape, there's abundant evidence for human activity, both past and present, plus the great variety of habitats and species. And the key thing is the AONB is a living and working landscape. So Natural England have defined natural beauty as not just the look of the landscape, but its landform and geology, plants and animals, landscape features, and the rich history of human settlement over the centuries. And to pin down this all-encompassing term natural beauty, the AONB partnership has grouped these elements together in what we've termed the special qualities. And these special qualities include the built environment. And to carry on with the cooking analogy, the built environment cannot be left out of the mix if we are to conserve and enhance the natural beauty of the Northumberland coast. So we're going to take a step away from these seascapes and sandy beaches, as it's not just the coastline that's designated as the nationally treasured landscape, but it's hinterland, and this encompasses towns, villages, steadings, isolated houses, and everything in between. Excuse me. So change in the built environment, change that conserves and enhances, be it a new housing estate or modifications in the core of a conservation area, begins with the understanding of context. And as we've heard this afternoon, an understanding of context is one of the key principles of good design. Boy, but it's hot in the kitchen. The built environment of the AONB is under pressures that continue to change in nature and intensity. So demand for tourist accommodation, rising house prices, architectural trends, lifestyle choices, impact of climate change, to name but a few, all against a backdrop of a supply chain for building materials that is national and global in reach, means we have an erosion of the character and appearance of our built environment. And just to widen the discussion to beyond that of design for new housing, if we look at degrees of change in the AONB, change to the existing fabric of the built environment can have a greater impact on the character and appearance of the landscape than new built. And it's for this reason that the AONB Design Guide includes advice on renovations and extensions, repair and maintenance, and landscaping in the public realm. So there's pressures, tourism, rising house prices, architectural trends, climate change, they all pose challenges for that primary purpose, that aim to conserve and enhance. So what are we doing about it? What are our recipes for success? As I've already mentioned, the title of the talk, we do have a design guide. It dates from 2007. And to be honest, well, the content is great, and we probably were ahead of the curve for having such a document. It isn't a document that's well used, and unfortunately the evidence that it's not a go-to guide is clear to see in the built environment of the designated landscape. So it's the intention that the revised design guide will be adopted as supplementary planning guidance. It's specifically mentioned in the forthcoming Northumberland local plan, and the greater emphasis on good design now in the NPPF should provide support. The refresh guide will also be supported by an up-to-date suite of conservation area character appraisals that for the 9 settlements that have conservation areas within the AONB will help with a furthering understanding of context. Engagement, outreach, the dissemination of the guide to communities and developers, architects and decision makers will be key. And for those resident communities and those with property interests, we need to engender care for the built environment and foster an understanding that its fabric and form is part of the natural beauty of the designated landscape. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah to talk more about the guide's update and its content and what we hope to achieve with it. Thank you for listening to part 1.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hi, thank you very much. Let me just get my, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, slide 1 of 17.
Very efficient, yes. Okay, so can you see the full slide? Or have I shared the wrong screen? Can you see my speaker's notes? No, it was looking good before, Sarah. No, and I've now pressed something. Just 1 second, everybody. Hold on. I'm your last speaker, so you can.
Well, while you're sorting that out,
Yep.
Sarah, Winlow, what were those 2 photographs of? Which places in your slide? Those last 2 places look lovely.
The last one was Walkworth with the chap on the bike.
Yeah.
And then it was Newton by the Sea on a
Right.
sunny day. And did you get the first one? It was Sea House up at Cockleburn. That's sort of an.
Yes.
You're spending too much time around Sunderland, Graeme.
Yes, I'll put those down on my list of places to go for a drive out to.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Sarah, we've got you on screen now. You got that presentation there, yeah. Great.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. That was a really helpful introduction to the emerging work we're doing. We're busy baking, to use that analogy, at the Northumberland Coast AONB. So I'm your last speaker. So cups of tea coming up. My name is Sarah Dyer, and I'm working with Sarah Winlow and team to look at the design issues within the AONB to update the existing design guide. So we're pretty much at the sharp end of the process, helping design proposals to achieve planning permission. Our design guide is going to apply to, as Sarah said, extensions, new garages, dormers, roads, hedgerows, signage, bins, etc., as well as new houses. So not just about a new development per se. We've got our existing design guide. It's extensive and detailed, but as some of you will be aware, planning policy has changed considerably since 2006, and the current design guide needs to be updated and reflect that. The NPPF was published in 2012 originally, and has evolved since then. It replaced a huge raft of planning policy and guides, and it both simplified and gave greater emphasis to particular areas. And particularly, I think what we're talking about today, the connection between creating beautiful places that can last for generations and meeting the sustainable development target that's been given greater emphasis over recent years. So more recently, we've had the National Design Guide and also the National Design Code that's published 2020 and 21, which puts further weight on the importance of well-designed places. Importantly, these are not just housing estates developed in isolation, but for example, they're instead a whole raft of interconnected issues. And I think previous speakers have all talked about this. We're not just talking about what a house looks like in a particular position. So as illustrated in the pie chart above, we can see some of those interconnected issues, and in the context of COP26 and the climate change emergency, we are looking at the design guide and putting greater emphasis on sustainable methods of construction and materials, as well as the end product being well designed. And it also includes adaptation and reuse of existing buildings, which I think, as Nicholas said, is an important component. In preparing for the design guide, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the ingredients, what should go into that, what matters and why does it matter. The most recent version of the NPPF defines the design guide as a document providing guidance on how development can be carried out in accordance with good design practice, often produced by a local authority. It does rely on both applicants and decision makers working on a proposal to start from a similar or same understanding. And sometimes that, in my experience, has been difficult to achieve. We're very aware, and as the definition gives in the NPPF, it is not about the local authority designing or building a place, but it is about achieving that happy balance through the decision-making process and giving the right weight to issues, as Rob talked about.
there's a fine balance between being too prescriptive and holding up examples of good design and enabling a culture of good design to flourish within an area. We know that small changes can have big impact, so we try to draw attention to those within the design guide as an example, to give ideas on how to better or improve houses, existing houses and buildings, to make changes in a positive way. The MPPF is clear in relation to the AONB. Great weight should be given to conserving and enhancing landscape and scenic beauty. It's not just any old landscape. So we're looking at protecting a whole raft of different issues, from heritage to views, landscape and much, much more, all interconnected and which aim to conserve and enhance the designated landscape. This image shows some of the interconnected ideas that we've all talked about in our previous talks. At the AONB, we're also looking at how it's become a specially designated landscape. This is about being authentic to its place and reflecting, as well as reflecting its own time. This can be the journey that's influenced the landscape, perhaps a spiritual journey, such as that illustrated by Holy Island, or perhaps the historic defensive or protective necessity that expresses itself in our buildings and settlements, such as the castles. It can also include the covered porches, small window to wall ratio to protect from the weather. Therefore, considerations such as what materials are hardy enough to survive in severe coastal conditions, design details that offer protection and long-term survival are also important. To this end, we've identified 11 characteristics or principles that should form the basis for good design, starting with context, siting, scale and massing, which are familiar starting points to many architects and designers working in the built environment. We've looked at our local buildings and spaces that already exist in AONB that we consider to make a positive contribution to the designated landscape, and not just about the buildings, but also about the puffins and the seals that share our landscape. We've also added a section on how to apply for planning permission and what to expect as a layperson, how to help manage those expectations for applicants and to ensure that those from the AONB are clear about the expectation we have to meet high design quality. We've got examples in the AONB of high quality modern design, but we'd like there to be more and we like to encourage it. And it's not just about being sort of reflecting the historic, it's about being reflective of our time now. And we've also got examples where small changes have had a big impact on the appearance of the building and not necessarily a positive one. So windows can change the appearance of a building quite dramatically. And so focusing and looking at those small changes, and when people are making smaller changes to their existing buildings, how can those positively appear on the building itself? We're not just looking at buildings, we've got a whole plethora of other areas, bins, signage, general clutter, which needs to be addressed and managed. And we hope that the design guide will start to look at these. So there's much more work to do, and it relies on a partnership between the AONB and the LPA to be good and clear about good design and work together to ensure that it can happen. But just to end with, and there's always one, we try to emphasise the importance of careful design through scale, massing, height, balanced composition. But this applicant, who calls himself the King of Northumbria, has submitted rendered image as part of a pre-application inquiry. Of course, we're looking at scale, massing, materials, form, context. It's a building, massive building between the village and the coastal area, closing off views. Surely it's a no. Of course, this is actually Bamburgh Castle, but given everything we write, it's amusing to think that some of our greatest buildings and spaces would never have been built. Sometimes exciting juxtaposition is a missing ingredient that we all need. So with that, one big massive thank you, and I'll hand over to Graeme.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for reminding us that good rural design isn't just about housing, and that the areas of national beauty are designed in their own ways, and it's good to know that it's being looked after so carefully. So thanks very much for that. Annie, are there any questions to ask? We're still within our time frame.
Yeah, well, what I've just put into the chat box is that we could go straight to a panel, collective panel questions if you wish. Well, I should just mention that Katrina Woodrow has said, I have really enjoyed this presentation, which has backed up my own conviction that good-looking buildings and homes have more value to the population than ugly ones. I've often been told that the way a house looks doesn't really matter during our planning meetings, but my response has always been that it should be, and she commends one or two of the speakers, which is fantastic. So it's not exactly a question. I think really we should go over now to a more collective questioning style. If everybody could come off mute, Graeme, if you could do that, and then people are free to unmute themselves individually, and I've suggested that they raise a hand in the reactions screen at the bottom. If you go to reactions in the black bit at the bottom of your screen, you can raise a hand if you've got a question for anybody. Or it might be just that you want to make a comment. John, would you like to start, John, by making that comment?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks, Annie. Yeah, just talking about the last speaker, one of the things that the NNN Society campaigned for many years was cutting clutter on signage on our rural roads and indeed in urban areas as well. There seems to be a reluctance from all agencies to coordinate with each other to utilize, say, a single post, if you like, for a number of different applications. So instead of having a series of metal posts going down the roadside, each with its own individual sign, you could combine. Now, I suppose the argument would be that each agency would want their own message to get across separately to a driver or a road user. So that might be not an option. But there's also, when you go around, you're probably the same as I, all of the people who are taking part in this, see signs that have been obsolete for many, many years, or roadworks or whatever, and they're just left to the detriment of the environment. Is this something that the council would look to address?
I don't know. I don't know if Rob is on the call. I don't think.
Sorry, I thought he was back.
But
I don't think Rob's on the call, and this is technically without of the housing domain there, but I don't know if anybody would want to answer.
I was going to
hands up.
I was going to mention to Nicholas Boyce. I don't know if Nicholas Boyce Smith is still on the call there, and he's there on the screen. I don't know if you've got any input on that, Nicholas, in terms of creating streets. Yeah,
I am still here. Hang on, let me just. Sorry. Could you just repeat the point? I must confess I wasn't fully paying attention. Please forgive me.
It was a point about street furniture and street clutter and how it can be almost overwhelming, and what might be done to change that, to improve that. Do you think that there's too much street clutter? I mean, certainly when you see a film from the 1950s, you're amazed by how our streets have changed in that way.
I mean, it's a very good question. Yeah, so yes, they are. And two, it's very hard to get rid of it, as I'm sure many of you know. This can sound like an anti-public sector point, it's really not. But if you're a public official, and this is not in any way profoundly disrespectful to them, safety first is a very good policy if you're a public official, because no one ever got fired for being careful. If there is a slight hazard here, or something does need to be said or could be said conceivably, and something does go wrong, and it might one day, and you weren't supporting that sign, then you can open yourself up to criticism. So that's essentially what happens. And I think you just need, and this is where you need, I think, strong leadership from the top of the council. You need someone to come in from the top and say, we're just going to clear half of this away. But that's quite hard to do. And highways officials will focus on the perceived safety of streets as opposed to actually how they work as places. So thinking of streets as places as well as things through which cars move at high speed is ultimately the only way we get around this. But in the short term, it's a jolly hard problem to solve.
Okay, there's two hands up I can see. One is Richard Cowan, and Richard is the chair of CPRE North East. So I dare say, in terms of rank, I should let you go ahead and ask your question, Richard.
Don't quite see why that should be, Graeme, but never mind. I was just wondering, we've seen a number of cases there of throughout the talks of developments that perhaps shouldn't have been allowed because they were in the wrong place or the wrong sort of design. I know Rob's not here, but how are we looking at trying to correct that? If planners ignore the design guide, we are seeing some examples of perhaps plan requirements not being followed when it comes to the crunch. But the only remedy that I see once the planning committee has made the decision is to go for judicial review. And that is a very expensive and risky way forward. Does anybody have any comments on that sort of thing as to how we may see?
I'd like to field that question to Crispin, and Crispin has got his hand up as well, I can see. So maybe you want to raise another point yourself, Crispin, our chair.
I was going, yeah, if that's all right, going to raise a different point about cost. I mean, so I'd just say to Richard, it's all about making sure the regulations have bias, isn't it? And the weight given to design needs to be very strong indeed. But we haven't talked much about cost, but Rob mentioned it, and I just think one of the things that worries me is that although we all know and we all believe that the long-term cost-benefit analysis shows that good design is better for us across the board and therefore for the economy, there's still a little bit of me niggling that all the great things that particularly Rob and Nicholas have highlighted that are the benefits of good design cost developers more. So the short-termist developers, of which there are many, will never take them into account. And I was out recently with the wonderful Prince's Foundation, who deserve plaudits. Somebody mentioned Houndbury, but there are lots of other examples of builders in that movement that are really emphasising and building good design, albeit on too small a scale still. But I was out with them visiting some sites recently, and I was struck by a lot of the sites were mixed, some of them beautifully designed with high quality local materials and vernacular, etc. But they were always the more expensive ones, and they'd often had extra money from somewhere or other. And I couldn't help noticing that there was mixed in there where there were cheaper places that didn't have those quite the same standards. So I worry, but we've got to be avert about this. How do we make sure that short-termism doesn't take over? And I think the answer is probably there's a big role for government here. The government has to compensate for that, and government is the body that has to take the long view and that broader view. And you've got to do that through the planning system.
Thank you, Crispin. There's three more questions which I'll take from Nicholas, from Nikki, and from Sharon before we'll wrap it up, simply because of the time factor, before I ask Colin Adsley to thank everyone for attending today. First of all, if we can go to Sharon.
Thank you. I was interested in Nigel's talk. He was talking about the vernacular design. And I'm thinking about the village where I live, where it's a lot of listed buildings. And we've got two houses which they're almost like a pastiche of the other buildings. And how, how easy, how difficult is it to successfully blend a new building in with old ones?
Well, I'll put that question to Nigel.
Well, it's quite interesting actually, because if you look at the Historic England's advice nowadays, and also in some of the design guides, they're certainly not adverse. In fact, quite the reverse to putting a contemporary design in amongst traditional areas or attaching a contemporary design. I mean, I was coming down the coast just south of Berwick the other weekend, and came across a very, very smart single-storey extension to a house. It probably is in the AONB actually, in grey brick with enormous windows. And I thought, well, that's really, pushing the boat out. And I'm not so sure that pastiche is the answer. I think a good contemporary design could well suit.
Well, I'll pass that on to Nikki, because Nikki, I think you've got architect in your title, so you might have a view on that as well. But yes, your point, please.
Thanks, Graeme. Yes, Nigel, it's it's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? And I think sometimes relying heavily on the traditional, or responding in a traditional manner, relies on the craftsmanship that perhaps some of those original buildings were built with, and at the moment we're not necessarily do have the level of the same craftsmanship in the construction industry. So I think we have to be careful about trying to recreate what was there before, which has been built in a very different context. Anyway, my question was actually, I guess it might be to Annie, but also Nicholas and Nigel may have a view. We've used the Building for Healthy Living guide a number of times recently in sort of framing development proposals, and I know, Annie, you're looking at you're basing your piece of work around that from what you've described, and I found it that it doesn't offer quite as much of that looseness, Nigel, that you referred to earlier when you were looking at housing layouts that perhaps are more relevant for more rural schemes. And I was interested as to know whether, Annie, you or others feel that there is some scope perhaps to expand that document to include, to support more rural developments, whereas I think it is rather more aimed at a more urban setting. Sorry, it's a rather technical question.
Annie?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a one size fits all, isn't it? It's a national guide. And when you've got a national guide, you're taking, you're trying to just distill it down to messages that are equally applicable across the whole nation. So, you know, it's obviously going to, the more extreme the context, whether that be an extreme between a sort of a rural urban spectrum or any other sort of spectrum, the less fit you're going to get, I guess. But I mean, they are suggestions, and then I guess, you know, people like the AONB can take guidance, generic national guidance like that, and work it into a more specific local context, building in you know, a close look at the vernacular and guidance on how that should be worked into you know, perhaps a contemporary framework.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Annie. And finally, to Nicholas, you've got your hand up, Nicholas. You might want to comment on what's just gone and been said before, but you also might have your own point that you wish to make.
No, I was just going to respond to a couple of points, if that is helpful. I think I've probably spoken too much already. To Richard's question, and I think Crispin, in a different way, almost made the same point. I mean, I think, so I can't comment on the design guide from 2006 in Northumberland, but having read quite a few of the design guides from that era in other locations, what's typically problematic about how they're used in practice, it's not a criticism of them as documents, is that that they're more verbal than visual. They're quite long. They often have deliberately quite different interpretations of their principles visually set out in images. And I'm afraid the consequence of that, and you know, again, this is a sort of planning barristers speaking, not me, is you can essentially do whatever you like with them. So I mean, they don't work as planning documents because they don't constrain. They do set up some quite good principles that it's impossible to ignore or disagree with, but it doesn't actually have any teeth in terms of what gets built, I'm afraid. So that's why many of them haven't actually worked. There is a separate but linked point, which I think, again, both Richard and Crispin have touched on, which is enforcement and that degradation of materials or design quality between outline and reserve matters planning application. And I think there is bluntly a lack of resources and skill in the enforcement section of too many councils. So I think that's a linked but separate point. On the pastiche point, I think Nikki's point about the lack of skill and craftsmen is fair and is well made, and I agree. I do think it's important not to get hung up on this word one way or t'other, actually, either against or for. You know, I mean, as I look round the screen, quite a lot of you wearing spectacles that could be said to be pastiche. My jumper's quite pastiche, and I can see several of you wearing, you know, with books that are very pastiche. There are forms and patterns that we use across time and across centuries because they work for us as humans, and that's why the same elements of streets and private and public and garden and different use of materials as appropriate to the climate just keep coming up century after century, millennia after millennia in different environments. So let's not get hung up on that. There is a reason why you know, a residential neighbourhood in Northumberland to some degree looks like it does, because it grows from the landscape and from what's appropriate. I think instead ask the question, what's good for the humans who live in it, what's good for the planet, and what is popular, and what leads to good connected lives. If that leads to something modern, great. If that leads to something pastiche, if you want to use that word, great too. And I think if you start from that question, you're lost, actually, either one way or other. It must look like it's old, it must look like it's modern. That's the wrong place to start. I would calmly, politely, but I hope passionately convey. And then on Nikki, your question about building for healthy life, and Annie's excellent response. Yeah, I think it's fair that building for healthy life. I think it's also true to say the National Design Code is more urban focused than rural. I think at one level that's not that surprising. More people do live in towns than in the countryside. I think probably somebody, I'm speaking my Great Streets hat on, but I hope that's something the Office to Place will get its teeth into in due course. How we live sustainably in a rural context, I think, is an important question that will come back. I think a very useful concept and way of thinking about this, which I'm sure, Nikki, you know about, but perhaps not all of you do, which I think is not quite as clear in the NMDC National Design Code as perhaps it ideally could be. It's sort of implicitly there, is the concept of the transect. And by that I mean, if you're like thinking of a slice of the way we live, from the city or the town centre all the way through to the outer countryside. There are a series of typologies set out in the National Design Code, which sort of implicitly do it. But I think if you think of development on that framework, and there are some things that change and some things that stay constant as you move from the city centre to the outer countryside. Actually, we're interesting. Some of the transects, many of them have been done in the States. We're currently working on one actually for a south developer focusing in the southwest to help them think about how they'll approach urban extensions and village extensions and new hamlets differently while keeping some of their principles the same. So I think that's a good way to think about it, and guarding some things that are similar or identical, that are unique to Northumberland, but perhaps express themselves differently in a town, in a village, or in the deep countryside. That's it.
Thanks for that, Nicholas. And it's a good point to finish on. I'm acutely aware of how generous you've been with your time this afternoon, everybody, especially our speakers, but also the people who've attended. I'm also acutely aware that England and Sri Lanka are playing in the T20, just recently kicked off. So probably a nice time to bring it to end and to ask Colin Adsley, the Chair of CPRE Northumberland, to offer a word of thanks to everybody. Colin.
Thank you, Graeme. It falls to my lot on behalf of the 60 or so participants this afternoon to thank our speakers. I don't know about you all, but my brain is reeling with the flood of valuable and worthwhile ideas and insights we've been treated to, and the flow of images across our screen for the last 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours even. It's been absolutely brilliant. How I can make sense of it all, I don't know. I did make a few notes, but I'm not going to add anything to the tremendous flood of words from these most articulate speakers that we've heard this afternoon. Thank you all very much indeed. On behalf of the audience that we've been able to assemble today, I finish with just a very simple plea, and that is, and I think I'm probably aiming this more than anyone at Nicholas Boys-Smith, who has of course got a foot in the door of the government, and it's simply to keep the dialogue going. It's been good to talk to people this afternoon. I've been very conscious of the fact that one area perhaps in this whole field of planning and building, that is the developers themselves, weren't here to put their case. But what's emerged for me this afternoon is that how do we counteract the tendency of developers to see their job as essentially putting individual homes before individual buyers and sealing that agreement that somebody will buy each of their houses individually and somehow convert them into thinking more about the community they're creating and its relationship to its immediate setting, whether it's a countryside setting or something more urban. But it's that relationship that matters. We've learned, I think, that the more homes and developments connect people in countryside, the more they empower those groups of people as a community and enable them to lead a healthy life, then the better they become. Thank you all very much for your attendance this afternoon, and a final word again of abject thanks to our speakers and greatest admiration for what they put before us today. Thank you all now.
That's great. Thanks. I'll draw this meeting to a close, and thanks everybody.
Thank you everybody, particularly to our speakers.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see everybody.
Bye now.